We're going to do a little bit different this year. I'm going to try to explicate what's going on over here, myself, and I cut down a few because some of these are just repetitive, won't serve our purpose. It boils down to 18. Therefore, the first one we're going to go into right away, as you can see over here, is the Baritoni Yirmiyahu Yoshiyahu, which you can follow the pages as I have them in this one, in the art scroll, most inspired, the newest edition, the one I have anyway, 2007, and they might be slightly off. And now, without any further ado, the reason I went right into this is because many of these keynotes, as we all know, are very obscure, and I don't think people get anything out of it, because you have to know 1,001 midrashim that are being highly alluded to by the Kaliri. However, when we get to the Honey Yirmiyahu Yoshiyahu, it's something different. The first significant keynote. It struck me when I was thinking about this yesterday is that the keynotes are organized, or one can organize them around several basic ideas. By Tisha, by Sheni, they skip Bar Kokhba, you got the Crusades, and then you have certain specific aspects of the Churban, such as slavery, massacre, and things of this nature. And at the end, you have some different things. And so we have so much on Tisha B'Av, obviously, by way of tragedies, that you can't encompass it all. But the story of Baritoni Yirmiyahu Yoshiyahu is like huge, because this is based on the fact that we're told that when King Josiah, when Yoshiyahu died, it says in the book of Kings, in the book of Melachim, that Yirmiyahu composed keynotes for him. So why? Who cares? And why over him and not over someone else? We don't see something unusual. There are even some opinions that our book of keynotes that we read last night is connected with this in some fashion or another. Here we go through the Vayis Rishon, which is a very depressing story. It's called the Bible. When you read, and I'm saying this seriously, the whole purpose of the Tanakh, I'm talking about the Tanakh now, not the Torah part. The Nevi'im Miksudim, the narrative books of the Bible are one long grand tragedy. They really are. That's how they're written. As a matter of fact, one where they composed, or more accurately, one where they edited, at the beginning of the Sheni period. Can you understand that? They actually gave us like Dola. So that means that having messed up round one, when they returned to Israel at the beginning of round two, the great man of Israel, actually gets like Dola, Ezra, and people like that. So let's get an exact ordering, the ordering we want to do it, and see how we messed up last time so we won't do it again. Unfortunately, in Tisha, as we know, they did not repeat the mistakes of Vayis Rishon, but they came with their own mistakes of Vayis Sheni, which is itself a lesson. I'm sure everybody knows, me to tell you that the first temple destroyed the Sefer Gila Rashvika than what is ours. That is not what happened in the second temple, but they had their own issues and that destroyed them anyway. So it's not sufficient merely to avoid the mistakes of the first time we have to do the second. Why do I say it's all one long depressing story? Because it is. The story is Yoshua, Shoftim, Shmuel, Malachim, Diriyam. What is all that about? It's about how the Jewish people came. This is a plain story to come up. The Jewish people came to Israel after the death of Moshe, of course, and more or less were supposed to be handed a big piece of territory for them to construct it in the right way, and they messed up from day one. And it's like the stock market. It's one long decline over 900 years. Little by little, they blew it and lost the country. There's a couple of blips along the way, as with some kind of stock market business. The other mouth was a little bit better. Sometimes a little bit better, but generally speaking, the trend is downward. And all you have to do, if you're interested, is read through Yoshua and then Shoftim and Shmuel and all the rest of it. And as I said before, the Tanakh was written specifically. The Tanakh was written specifically as a Musar lesson, so that people would learn what it takes to hold on to Israel and what it does not. What I mean by that is that when the Jews came to Israel, we're told in time of Yoshua, so the main rule was that they should conquer all of Israel, and I mean all of it without exception. We're now reading Dvarim, Matas Masei, it says in the Chumash, Moshe, the peace, many times, make sure that nobody left behind. Either kick out the Canaanites or kill them or something, but it should be a bubble. There should be an all Jewish area in which there are no others left there. And it's not simply a matter of racism or something like that. You see from over here that the grand design was that when the Bnei Yisrael will enter Israel and divide the land among themselves, they'll have an all Jewish society with no other what shall I say, no other temptations, no other interfering factors, and hopefully they will actually construct a model society, Torah society. And the Jews were the only monotheists, and the idea was that if they'll do it right, I mean, it would be a nice world if we kept the whole Torah, right? Including V'ahavta Re'echa Kamocha, plus Shabbos, plus everything. And if they actually did that, then we would be the salvation of mankind. Because then, if they would construct a model society that would really work, then other people around the world would see this, and they'd say, little by little, mankind would evolve without violence into a higher form, and they would do monotheism, and they would accept themselves to be good to one another, and lo yisa goy al goy cherev, and it would have been great. This was the plan. This was God's plan. It's not simply that we Jews are supposed to enjoy ourselves and everybody else can jump in the lake, but on the contrary, the Jews are hopefully be a light to the goyim and a model society, and this will lead all of mankind in the way to the best course for mankind. That's why the Chazal say very often, and I'm sure some of you know this, that they hurt themselves when they destroyed the Beis HaMikdash. Okay? They shouldn't have been happy over it, they just didn't realize because they're insufficiently enlightened to realize this. We're not out to rule the world, we want to provide a good model, a utopian model. But in order for this to happen, you have to have a situation where it's all Jewish, there's no other temptations, there's no outside force interfering. Let everybody do their things out there. And here, within the territory called Israel, will create, as they see, the right society. Unfortunately, as we know from the book of Yeshua, the original sin is that they did not do this. They had only conquered 2/3 or something like that of the land. And therefore, the reality was that wherever the Jews lived, next door, a valley away, or something like that, are the Canaanites, the Canaani, and Moab, and all the rest of it. And this left two bad consequences. Number one, they weren't able to defend themselves just exactly like the state of Israel today. They have a huge number of Arabs and others in the middle, right there. And also, the next several hundred years, they're always attacking them and giving them trouble. And more importantly, from the religious point of view, what it meant was that you have paganism of the worst variety all over Israel, right next door to the Jews. So what you have for hundreds and hundreds of years was a situation in which on one hill is a Jewish settlement, and in the other hill or the valley is a pagan settlement. And therefore, what are the kids going to do? Would they rather go to shul on Saturday morning, or rather go to the other place on Saturday night and have a good time? That's what will happen. And unfortunately, with like a cancer, and little by little, the ideas of the leftover pagans, the Canaani, Moab, and all that, spread over into the Jews, and you had idol worship. And this was a big problem throughout the entire Byzantine period, for the next 800 years. The period of the Shoftim and the period of the Temple. And little by little, it went down. And so we find that Nevi'im and kings and others are always warning the people, don't do this, don't go off the derech, don't follow what the idolaters are telling you, and all that. Don't be unfaithful to God who took you out of Egypt and gave you so many, and it doesn't matter, because in the long, long, long run, unfortunately, paganism went out. You understand? Now, it's not so simple, because the belief in one God has its problems, the belief in many gods has its problems. People like paganism, first of all, because it explains why the bad things happen to the good people. Monotheism cannot explain that. Anyone, Mishalva, say, Yisur, it's pretty that says it. You don't have a good answer for that. And they do. You know, they'll say, this God got you on Wednesday, and the other God got you on Thursday, and it was all that business. And there are many, issues like this. And therefore, the result is that there was a constant struggle, tension, between Judaism on one hand and Avodah Zarah on the other hand for the next millennium. Okay? And we didn't do that great of a job. This is a sad fact. And Hashem warned them through Nevi'im and all this generation after generation after generation, but as we know, it didn't work. And you follow this through as you go through Yeshua and then Shoftim over hundreds of years, you see constantly repeating itself. And then to add it to that, they made a big mistake also, which is they switched the form of government. And the book of Shmuel talks about the fact that after being for a couple hundred years under what he called the Shoftim, which is obviously the way God wanted it, shouldn't be a king, Yami Mohain Ein Melech Yisrael, Ish Gechol Yoshav Meinavi Hased, that was supposed to be a good thing. But instead, the people eventually said, we want a king. And theoretically, a king, as you know, concentrates power in one hand, so that can be a good thing, or it can be a bad, correct? If it's a good king, then everything's great. However, you've created an instrument of power, an office, which if it's bad is really, really bad. And so, unfortunately, as I'm sure everybody knows, the story is that Hashem told him don't do it, the prophet Shmuel told him don't do it, he warned them against dictatorship on the part of the king, and things like that, in the Sefer Shmuel, but the people said we want a king anyway. And the first three kings were not so bad, Shaul, and David, and Shlomo. I won't say it was perfect, but it was pretty good. And those three at least were from Jews. And at that time, the concentration of power in the office of a king at least did not lead to any kind of religious decline. They had their issues, no question about it. But after Shlomo, certainly, then things went downhill because what happened is, this is the Sefer Malachim in Tiriyam, what happened was that it split into two. That, as you know, it came to a fight who should be king. Then it broke into two kingdoms, so that itself was bad. Because now you have not one, but two kings, and second of all, they're fighting each other, so for hundreds of years. I repeat, for hundreds of years. Jews ended in a civil war, which you couldn't have a civil war if it wasn't a king. If the shoftim, if nobody's in charge, there's no central power. You can't have people fighting over who should have the top position originally. But when there was a king position, then they fought over it, and it was pretty bloody. In the book of Divrei Yamin, we have a battle, for example, where Yoram ben Nevat, leading the north, was fighting the king of the south, Abiyahu, and the king of the south defeated him and killed 500,000 of the north in a day. That means one set of Jews killed 500,000 of the other set of Jews over the fight over who should be king. Not only that, but the victors went ahead and chopped off the noses of the corpses so that the wives would be alone, so you couldn't be able to identify. That's how, unfortunately, that's what happens with civil wars and civil strife when passions get exceeded. One side wants to really stick it to the other side. Notice, the frum side did that to the non-frum side, so to speak. So it goes to show you how bad things were. Okay? If there hadn't been a king, this obviously wouldn't have happened. 500,000 in a day. In a day. And other wars were waged like this, and you see that the whole king business wasn't working out so great. And the result was that for the next couple hundred years, the Jews were in two warring kingdoms, which usually were at war with each other, sometimes were not at war with each other, sometimes were allied, you know. And plus you had the rest of the Middle East junk like you have today. The other enemies were constantly fighting and invading them. Aram, which is Syria, Moab, and Ammon, and Edom, and Egypt, and eventually Ashur and Babel, and all this. It was tough. It was really tough. And so the period of Tanakh is not a pretty picture. That's not how they wrote it. You don't get a pretty picture out of all this. And what happens, therefore, is that you have two kingdoms, the south and the north. The king, neither was great from the religious point of view. But the kingdom of the north, which is Rov Kol Yisrael, 10 of the 12 tribes more or less, was committed from day one to Avodah Zarah. Every one, this is sad, every one of the kings of the north, 20 or 21 kings, was idol worshiper, without exception. The only difference is, was it hardcore Avodah Zarah or softcore Avodah Zarah? Was it the Egel Hazov, because that was the idol that was set up. Many people don't know this, maybe they're better off that way, but the Egel Hazov eventually won out. The golden calf reappeared with Yerovam ben Nevat, the first king of the north, who set up two temples, very popular temples, in the central Israel and northern Israel. The southern part of his kingdom, the northern part of Israel, Beisel and Tel Dan, where they take you today on the tourists. And these were very popular temples dedicated to the golden calf. And they never were destroyed. And the people worshipped them and all that stuff for hundreds of years. And I'm talking about 10 of the 12 tribes of the north. And in the south, it was 50-50. Some of the kings were okay, meaning they were Shomer Shabbos and they believed in Judaism, and many of the kings were not. Just like I said before, they're just straight in the Bible. It's not fun, but it's there. And when you get to the second half of this period, you know, the first half of the kings of the south were just basically losers, most of them. You know, without going into details, they were losers. But they made terrible mistakes and so forth. There was one or two exceptions, but most of them were bad. But when you get the second half of the kings of the south, I repeat, forget the north, the kingdom of Yehuda, where at least officially the religion is supposed to be Judaism. They had Yerushalayim. They had a Beis Hamikdash. They had all these things in there. Sometimes they messed those up, but at least officially with Judaism. But when you get to the second half of this period, starting from King Achaz on, then you have kings of Yehuda, the grandchildren of David HaMelech, who were unfortunately pathologically opposed, like sickos, to Judaism. And what I mean by that is, you have a series of kings, Achaz and Menashe and Amon, and later Yoakim, who declare war on Judaism. You understand? It's one thing if a person says like this, I'm going to trade myself, it's not my business, it's my business, I'm not telling you what to do. I myself am not going to be a Shomer Shabbos, all the rest of it. But it's something else if I say I'm going to kill everybody that eats kosher. I'm going to destroy the Torah. Literally, I mean, burn every Sefer Torah. That's what they did. They burned every Torah. They say there was a story, one of them was hidden away, but just the thought that you'd have a government which could command soldiers and would listen. And they would go after, burn every Sefer Torah, and close every school or yeshiva, and kill everybody that they knew was connected with the Torah. And this is Jewish government doing it to Jews. Okay? That you would have kings like Achaz and Menashe who take the base of Mikdash, and you say, well, the base of Mikdash. Here we are in Tisha, we're mourning the holiest place, and we lost it, and all this kind of stuff. These are Jewish kings, and first of all, you put an idol in the Kodesh HaKadoshim. They try to get rid of, if they can, the Ten Commandments and the other, holy things of Judaism. They reconfigure the architecture of the temple to conform to paganism. They get rid of like Achaz, he heard that the king of Ashur constructed a huge altar, Mizbeach, in Damascus, so he sends the Kohen Gadol up to Damascus to make a copy so he can go down and put that in the temple in Jerusalem. These are not Mefarshim, these are straight in the Tanakh. And we enter a period in which things are pretty bad. Not only that, but as I said before, it's really pathological. Pathological means you can't explain a regular situation. Like the Gemara says, in order to totally shatter any kind of Jewish, what shall I say, inhibitions. So Achaz rapes his own mother, I think it was, and one did to his sister, one did to his mother, one did this, and but this is already beyond. This is as the Gemara tells us about, I think Achaz. He says, I hate the Shekhinah, I want to get out of here. So if we fill the land full of Averis and sins, then the Shekhinah will even will be totally rid of this Jewish business. Okay? Here's what our own sources tell us about Jewish kings, not enemy kings. That's the point I'm getting. These are not invaders of Nebuchadnezzar or Ashur or people like this. These are Jews on Jews. Okay? One of the things we mourn today, I think, is that they put, is that right today? Salom Heichal, or is that Shivas at the Tammuz? But the point is that somebody put an idol in the Kodesh HaKodashim. It was a Jewish king, Menashe. You get it? And you had a succession of these guys, one after another, interrupted with two people in this entire second temple period who were good. You understand? So in other words, specifically, Achaz, and the Chizkiel, he was good, and the Menashe and Amon, the Yoshua was good. Then Yoakim, Yoachin, together, they're all bad. So there's two people that were good. And they weren't that good. When I say they're good, no, they gave it the old school try. And they did their best. And what's sad is the best wasn't good enough. You see, the best wasn't good enough. And we're told in the Tanakh that Menashe, who was a Jewish king, he actually ruled longer than anyone else, 55 years, the longest reign in Jewish history, unfortunately. And he said he covered the land with blood from one end to the other. He was a Jew on Jew. In addition to all the idols and all the violations of sexual immorality that he could think of, and whatever else is out there. No, basically went through the Torah and said, let me see what you're not allowed to do, let's do it. And what does the Torah say you shouldn't do? Like that. Or one of these other kings got his kicks. The Gemara tells us out of cutting out God, the curse, out of cutting out God's name from the Sefer Torah. This is not normal anymore. Correct? Like I said before, if you yourself want to drive on Saturday, that's your business. But when you're going like this, you're actually out to stamp out Judaism, and this is not the Romans. This is the period that is evoked by this first kingdom. Okay. Now the two exceptions were Achaz's son, who was Hezekiah Chizkiyahu, who ruled for 25 years, and he did his best to reverse all this. When he became king, the first thing he did was publicly drag his father bones through the streets. Some people might remember this from the Mishnah. and disassociating himself with the father's policies, and he tried his best to revive Judaism. It took him weeks to clean up the Beis Hamikdash. You want to get an idea of how bad the damage was to the Beis Hamikdash by Jews. We're told he became the king right after the beginning of the month of Nisan. So you know and I know that means that a few days going to Pesach. But there's no way that the Beis Hamikdash can be cleaned up from all this junk for Pesach. This is not possible. And so what he did was something unusual. Many will recall this. They made a leap year even though it already was after Nisan had started. And typically speaking, you're not supposed to do a new leap year, make an Adar Sheni. And some people didn't agree with it, but he said we need another 4 weeks to clean this place up. Just to give you an idea of the times we're talking about here. When we talk about Tisha, we are talking about what the enemy has done to us. Unfortunately, though, if we want to be honest about it, as you see over here, we also talk about what we did to us. That's what it is. And he cleaned it up and he did his best and all that, but as soon as he died, his son took over Menashe. As I told you before, was the worst of the worst. If you want to know what kind of a person Menashe is, besides everything else I told you, the prophet Isaiah, Yeshayahu, was his uncle, and he was prophesying against him, and so he killed him. We're told Yeshayahu hid inside of a hollow tree, so he cut the tree in half. You see? This is the type of people that we have over here. Now, in this context, you can understand that Judaism was in a real bad state. And I mean really bad state. It was like Fahrenheit 451. You know, they got rid of all the books, and except for a few people that the rest of their lives either had Torahs or Torah knowledge and had kept their mouth shut, except when in a very restricted circle, and this is a Jew on Jew. And it was in this context that Yoshio was born as king, this last the king, the subject of today's Kinnah. It's not just out of nowhere. And therefore, he grew up knowing nothing about Yiddishkeit. Because he was 8 years old, we're told, when he became king. That means his father was Ammon, who outdid Menashe in his wickedness. If I remember correctly, the Gemara said Menashe did with his sister, and Ammon did with his mother, you know, that sort of thing. So, really bad news. And here's somebody who was born in the reign of Menashe, and his father was king for 2 years before he was assassinated. And then, no, he was so wicked that they couldn't even take it at that time to degraded people. And then the son became king, grandson, whatever, when he's 8 years old, which of course means he's not a king yet. And for the first year, and he doesn't know anything about Judaism, and you can't blame him, you can't be surprised. And for the first years, he's just going along, you know, probably with a regency or something like that. And the Tanakh tells us, this is sad, that Menashe so ruined the people that it was basically, the damage was irreparable. You understand? He so got everybody used to Gila Rais, Shvicha Dam and Avodah Zarah, that it's not easy to get rid of it. Not among the masses. It's the problem of drugs today. You can get rid of it, but then it shows up again. So what you really have to do if you want to get rid of drugs is get rid of the desire for it. That's much harder. Right? You can actually destroy the stuff, but you can't destroy the desire for it, and it'll be there 5 minutes later. That's how everybody felt about idols, as you'll see in a second. And so the result was that when this kid becomes king, he's like clueless, and then somehow or other, nobody knows exactly how, 8 years ago, I think, or something, get into his reign when he's a teenager. So somebody got to him from the Frum. It's enough material for a movie. We don't know the exact details. But listen to what I'm saying. That's how he got to him from the Frum. In his reign, something very remarkable happened. And remarkable things are always happening, but it depends how we interpret them. And by that I mean that the great world power at that time was Ashur, Assyria, what we call today Central Iraq. And they had wiped out the kingdom of the 10 tribes. As you know, Rove Minyan and Rove Minyan and Klal Yisrael are gone long before Tisha B'Av came along. Okay? Here we are, we read the Torah about Joseph and his brothers. They're gone very early from Jewish history. Right? Where's Ephraim? Where's Menashe today? Or Reuven? We suffer his own done, Naftali Barasha. We're so used to it, we don't even think about it. They're not even there. And they went long ago, long before Tisha B'Av. Okay? Hundreds of years ago before Tisha B'Av. So, and who did it? Iraq. Ashur, as they call it, Nineveh with a capital C. And this was like a tyrant power, like Saddam Hussein, and there for hundreds of years. And you couldn't do anything about it. And they destroyed the Jews, and they, as you know, they devastated even the rest of Israel, even the tribes they didn't wipe out, they mauled them and all that. Only Yerushalayim was saved by a miracle. And then, in the reign of Yoshiyahu, when this young guy becomes a king, like I say, somebody got to him and told him a little bit about Judaism. I repeat, a little bit about Judaism. And he started to do a little bit. We don't know exactly how much, a little bit. Think about someone who's raised and never heard of the Torah. And the Assyrian Empire fell. Not because of the Jews, but because it was destroyed by the Babylonians, no, because of the Iraqi wars. And whoever is there tells them, see, you started to keep a Boer and Bishul and Asherfel. If you keep this up, things will go your way. You understand? It's like we would say today, all of a sudden, if everybody in Israel would, I'm just making some, unfortunately, if everybody in Israel would say they're going to keep half of Shabbos, and then next thing you know, they find themselves due for oil. Different world. And so he was encouraged in this, and he went on, and one of the things he ends up doing is he says, let's repair the Beis Hamikdash, because you can imagine, unfortunately, what the temple looked like after some of these Jewish kings had gotten through with it. The place chock full of idols, scratched on the wall, the Mizbeach and all the other things hidden away, replaced with all kind of pagan items. In other words, it didn't look like a Jewish temple, and this was Jew and Jew. And he famously goes and orders a reconstruction, what do you call it, a facelift. And the story is they find the old Torah, and it's a very sad story because they find the Torah, many say Moshe Rabbeinu's original Torah had been hidden away, so people wouldn't find it. It's sort of like a Snow White story, the bad guy shouldn't find this Torah, so they hid it under somewhere. And they said, what's this? They bring it to the king, and they read it, and the Torah and all that, and this is a very moving scene. And they call the lady, Huldah Hanavi, the prophetess, to say, what does this all mean? And she says, this is God's way of telling you better repent or else, because the destruction is around the corner. You've had your hundreds of years, which I give you a lot of leeway, but now basically the cup is full. If you do anything worse, then your destruction will come. And Yoshio becomes obsessed, properly so, with this incident, and he launches a whole campaign to exterminate idolatry from the country. And it's pretty sad. I mean, when you start reading through, as page after page, you see, got rid of this idol on this street, on Park Heights, and Green Spring, and in Lower Baltimore, and in this. No, really, one after I'm not going to take the time to read it all. You could read it yourself. None of these things are any mafarshim. You just straighten it into enough. And the chariots of fire that were on top of the temple building, and the huge curtains that the women used to sew in the Beis Hamikdash. Women in the sew in the Beis Hamikdash for this goddess. You have no idea how bad things were over there. The roofs and in the valleys and all over the place. And he even destroys, listen to this, he even destroys the churches that were located on the Mount of Olives, Har Hazeisim, which everybody knows is across the valley from Beis Hamikdash, which were built by the wives of Shlomo HaMelech, churches, which hadn't been taken down for hundreds of years. That's the big list. Yerushalayim, once upon a time, didn't necessarily think the way you do. And I'll say for the 15th time, this was not something that the enemy did to us, this is what we did to us. So, and he gave it a huge try, and he even is able to go north. The kingdom of Yehuda was always the small area around Jerusalem. But as a result of what I said, which was that the Assyrian Empire, Ashur, dissolved under attacks from its enemies, so you had the same situation that you and I experienced 20 years ago with the downfall of the Soviet Union. All of a sudden it was a power vacuum. There's no Russian army in Europe, in Eastern Europe. All of a sudden, the whole northern half of Eretz Yisrael, The whole northern half of Eretz Yisrael, the majority of the country, was empty of foreign troops because the Assyrian Empire just dissolved for its own reasons. And so Yoshiyahu is encouraged by the Nevi'im like Yirmiyahu and see, you're getting more and more religious, and God is making the whole thing fall in your lap without a fight. Ashur is gone. The whole north of Israel, you don't have to conquer, you just come in and take it over, which he does do. And it's amazing, he already has dreams of bringing back the 10 tribes. There are even some traditions that the prophet Jeremiah did bring back the 10 tribes. I don't know how it works out. And he goes in the north and he finds idols there, of course, left over from the Jews in the old days and from the new Arabs that moved in. He destroys these idols. And he goes, as I say, with a magnificent obsession to try to reverse the tide of history, to reverse what's been going on for hundreds of years. The tragedy is that no one can reverse hundreds of years of damage. That's beyond, or at least let's put it this way, he didn't succeed. And as I said before, the reason is that once you have people that are corrupted in character, then you can't do it by government policy. This is our problem we have in America today. The government can try to control the supply of drugs, but they don't know how to make people not want to do drugs. You understand? How does a government restore morality? In the area of I don't know, sex and things like that. Yeah. And how do you do that? The government knows how to deliver a check. They don't know how to change people's minds. And so the Chazal tell us, I'm sure many have heard in the past, the Yoshio sends inspectors to everybody's house to make sure that there are no idols there, but they hide them behind the doorpost. So it means if you can't get rid of the desire of the people for idols, so there's no good just trying to do, and that's the great tragedy. But he doesn't give up, and he keeps. If you read the book, he throws another campaign and another campaign to try to get rid of more and more of the bad things in there, but it's hopeless. And then he gets killed in battle. It's very famous that the Egyptian army was marching through for its own reasons to go fight another battle. He tried to block him, he got killed. And when that happens, the prophet Yirmiyahu, who's a prophet, he sees where it's going. And by calling Yirmiyahu Yoshio, this is the last hope. Because I know who his children are, and I know who the rest of the family is, and I know everybody else out there. And number one, they're not him, and nobody is. And number two, they're not even going to try. And with the death of the last person who tried, so Yirmiyahu says, basically the Churban is here. Whether it happens today or 25 or 30 years, but the Churban is here. And that is the terrible destiny of the prophet Jeremiah. From the beginning of the book, God says you're going to give all kind of prophecies of doom, and Jeremiah says, I don't want to do this. I don't even like this. And Hashem says, B'terem Yitzchak b'betni dati, I designated you before you were born. You have no choice. Yirmiyahu hates being a Navi because he has to see, like Cassandra, he has to see the Churban, and he knows that he's supposed to tell everybody to stop, and he knows nobody will listen. There's nothing as sad as that. What's your purpose? The answer is to get it on record. And so that's why we're told when we look over here, like Yirmiyahu Yoshio, and Shmon Shana Shmuel Havi was 8 years old when he got from, and this is told in a, what should I say, in a poetic form. This is a king, I guess, from Eliezer Kaleri, and it's therefore interested in getting most of the, all the Kinas are poems. And because they're poems, they're with literary style. And so not interested in giving you the nitty-gritty facts, but you evoke the images. So, no king was like him since the time of Moshe Rabbeinu, as they said before. Well, at least he tried. And he talks about the fact that they hid the idols behind the doors, as I just said. It's killed by the Egyptians who were black from the Nile River. Okay? And he's not able, God held his hand back from helping him. These are all nothing but, as I say, evocations of what's going over here. As you see a few lines down on page 190, if you care to, Mechatas Stiras Mezuzos, the sins of the hiding of the mezuzah. meaning the idol in the doorpost. All the drugs are gone, but whenever you want them, it's there. This is a fact of life. If you don't get rid of the people's desire for something, it's always going to be there. King Saul, the night before he dies, says, I want to go to a witch. And then the next pasuk says, and Saul had wiped out all the witches. But as soon as he said, I'm looking for a witch, they said, how much, when, and where? Just went down the road. I was like, well, there are no drugs here, there's nothing. But how much you want and when? And the people want it, and they're not going to get rid of it. The corruption that commences at the time of Yeshua Nun, and only took vacations, but never left the desire for Avodah Zarah, the susceptibility, the terrible susceptibility that we Jews have to the cultures of those around us. It's just a fact. It's as true today as it was then. Maybe it's popular to talk about it, it's not, but it is what it is. And this is the reason why very frum try to create a bubble. Understand? I'm not saying that works either, but you try to put the kids as much as possible in a cocoon. But they're afraid that if they're exposed to the other things, like was the case at the time of the Tanakh, people are going to go for the preferred Avodah Zarah to the Jewish. But it's hard because people have tendencies where you look out and you want to do it. And what you end up having is, they said, it's hypocrisy. It's the chazon steers mezuzahs. The people take the item, but they hide it in the door. The modern definition of this would be to hide the television in the, the bedroom or something like that. And he goes on, therefore, to say that, therefore, the Katz steers mezuzahs was because of the sin of those who hide behind the things behind the doors. Chazon ansosi echel levazos. That's why they made fun of the vision of Isaiah, who was from Anatot. Some of you have been in Yerushalayim, near Yerushalayim, a place called Anatot, the valley deep down. That's where the Kohanim lived in the time of the prophet Yirmiyahu. And why would they make fun if somebody's saying doom is coming? Why would you dance on the, what's the expression, on the Titanic? But it's not true, people do. That's what Rabbi said like this. Is it a fact that people have diabetes, eat sugar anyway? It is a fact. Why would somebody do that? Because when you're in high school, everything's supposed to be normal. If there's a fire, you don't jump in a fire. But when you get a little bit older, you find plenty of people jump in a fire. Human beings are so constituted. And so, therefore, he wants to emphasize that the death of Yoshio was, A, the last guy who cared, and B, was tragic because it shows the life of the failure. And it was the life of the failure because the Jews so committed to the other way of life, and whoever takes the trouble to read Yirmiyahu and Yecheskel, right, who are two prophets that lived through and talk about what was going on in Yehuda after the death of Yoshio, the last kings, which is Kim and Kin and then which got Tzidkiyahu, a period of 30, 40 years, you get a very tough picture of which Jews are acting worse and worse. The prophet Yecheskel, who lives in Babylonia, is given a virtual reality tour. I'm serious. He's taken by an angel, and he's shown by flying over with X-ray vision what's going on in Jerusalem, because Yecheskel is saying, why are you going to destroy the city? It's so holy. And the angel says, you must see what's really going on. And he flies over and he looks at the Beis HaMikdash, among other places, and you see, I'm serious about it. He says some people are deliberately mooning the Mizbeach, yes, and other people are having pagan ceremonies inside the chambers of the walls of the Beis HaMikdash. It looks good from the outside, but inside they're doing Avodah Zarah, and all kinds of things are just happening over there, and you can't change people's minds. And so as a result of this, the Beis HaMikdash, as we all know, got totally destroyed. I shouldn't say totally destroyed, but the Beis HaMikdash was burned, and the rest of the city went down, and we lost the Temple of Solomon and our independence and everything that went along with it, and they never quite got it back. Because the Bayis Sheni period was, as many know, a pale imitation of the Bayis Rishon in many respects. In the 400 or 500 years of the Second Temple era, almost never was an independent state of Israel. It was almost always a province of some other empire. The Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. It is what it is. In the first temple, for better or worse, we had our own independence. But we cry over the fact that we didn't know what to do with our independence. And Spirit will now recite the keynote there by coming Yirmiyahu Yoshio. Rishon period, the construction of the first temple with its issues, to the Romans, to the second temple, with a separate set of issues. And as I said before, the way the Chazal put it classically is that it wasn't a problem of the big three Gilarai, Shpich Adom, and Zora, that there wasn't idolatry, for example, in the second temple period, which is interesting. You recall Hanukkah, the Jewish people, those who could, fought back against idolatry. But on the other hand, as we all know, you had Sinas Chinam, which is usually misunderstood as what we understand today, Sinas Chinam, I just don't like you. But no, Sinas Chinam is a civil war. Okay. The second temple period, particularly the second half, was unfortunately characterized by the antithesis of Achdus. In order, this is a thing that many people don't understand, that we live in tragic times today, and I don't know how to do anything about it, but the Torah wants that all the Jews should be in one group. That's a value in and of itself, which is gone to us in the modern reality. And it's not just a nice thing. No, it's a central value. The good and the bad. You all know the mashal of the lulav and the esrog. You all know the mashal of the Torah. These are Chazal. These are not some modern rabbi making a speech. The idea that everybody should be in one group, some better and some worse, I repeat, some worse, is an essential Jewish idea. And the Beis HaMikdash actually has a lot to do with that. On the other hand, in the second temple period, the opposite happened, where not only had this unity, but so much disunity, they actually formed separate groups and went to war with each other. For example, the Prushim and Sadukim, as many know, the Hellenists and the Maccabees, later on the Zealots and the Amorites. So much so that the period when the war broke out against the Romans was one which unfortunately was characterized by the fact that more Jews were killed by Jews than were killed by Romans. You know what I said? That's right. More Jews were killed in that war by other Jews in civil wars, the struggle with other Jews, than the Romans killed. It was so bad that Josephus tells us that the Roman army stayed away from Jerusalem for 2-3 years for a reason. And the reason was, why should we do it? They're doing a very good job. More or less, I'm sure what Israel is saying today, don't interfere in Syria, let them all kill each other. You see? That's what the Romans said about the Jews, and they were correct. So this is really a bad news. This is something that is told in excruciating detail in the writings of Josephus who lived there, and is confirmed more or less in less detailed forms in the Chazal. So, for example, you don't need me to tell you that Yochanan Zaka was the big rabbi, had to sneak out of the city and pretend to be a corpse. But they want to kill him simply because he said, let's negotiate with the Romans. You all know this story. Right? And that speaks volumes. That's the Gemara's way, without going into all the gruesome details, of giving an idea of the violent nature of the disunity which characterized Jews and Jews with a Beis HaMikdash in the Bayesheni period. Since we're now going to be talking about, again, a sort of stylized, poetic evocation of the capture of the Beis HaMikdash, destruction by the Romans, so I want to preface this by reading from Josephus' eyewitness account of the actual Tisha B'Av and the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. And he says, obviously he's got a whole book where he goes into Rachel B'Chakatana, all the little details about how the Romans, who were experts in siege warfare, were able to take one part after another. Jews never really had a chance from the military point of view, because the Romans were just very professional, and the Jews were the opposite of professional. Let me see, who's that? If anybody wants to see themselves, especially at the Tisha B'Av, you can look at it here. here, unfortunately, I'm holding up a picture of what's called the Second Civil War, meaning this is the different parts of the city of Jerusalem fighting each other before the Romans show up. Who has the upper city, and who controls the Temple Mount, and which group controls the other part, and one attacks the other, and they massacre A massacres B, and B massacres A, and so on and so forth. And then you have this picture over here, right? Again, people can see it later on. It's an appropriate time in Tisha to look at it, of the conquest of Jerusalem in 70 AD, which means that the siege of Yerushalayim by the Romans wasn't that long at all. It began after Pesach. So the Romans basically waited for the pilgrims to leave after Pesach, more or less. So figure around Rosh Chodesh ER, is that right? So it's ER Sivan Tammuz, and then as you know, the beginning of Av, it's over. And not only that, but if you follow the details that you can see over here, you'll see that the Romans penetrate the new city in the 7th of ER, meaning a week or so after it began the siege, they already broke into the outer wall of Yerushalayim, the wall that had encompassed the newer areas. The Agrippa, the Jewish king, had built a wall there to take into Yerushalayim the new suburbs. To use a modern example, for my modern terms, you'd say not only the old city, but of course Sharim and Geula and Sanhedria and the Beit Vagan. They took in a wall around that, and that the Romans broke into right away, and they established a new camp within the city. And then a week later, they breached the second wall, earlier into the city. And then 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, on the 5th of Tammuz, the Romans take the fortress of Antonia. That many of us have been in Israel. You've gone to the excavation sites. Antonia was the Roman fort adjacent to the temple, right? Named after Mark Antony. So there was already on the 5th of Tammuz, before the 3 weeks, they're already adjacent to the Hertzbergs. And then a week later, or 10 days later, on what you and I call Shivasar B'Tammuz, of course, they break into the Hertzbergs. The wall around the whole complex, as you know by now, the Kotel that we go today is not the wall of Beis HaMikdash, is it? It's the wall of the Hertzbergs. And beyond there, in there, was the Beis HaMikdash buildings. And then the attack against the temple itself is mounted on the 8th of Av. And so what we are now going through, what we call Bein HaMetzarim, the 3 weeks, was a time in which the Jews and the Romans were fighting, 3 weeks, the Jews and the Romans were fighting on the Hertzbergs, right, against each other. And and the Romans are trying to break into the inner buildings themselves. So they've already got all of Yerushalayim, or most of it. And they're up there on the top. And as you know, it's July and August, it's very hot and dry. And they're fighting back and forth. And what happens is that a whole bunch of times the Romans try to assault under Titus the temple, and the Jews are, fighting it back. And then comes the 8th of Av. Not the 9th of Av, but the 8th of Av, as he calls it here, the month of Luz. When by the 8th of the month of Luz, 2 of the legions had completed the embankments. And that's siege warfare. You just pile the earth high enough. You can bring up your siege machines like catapults and things and shoot at them. And when that isn't good, then you can then send your engineers to build the embankments forward a little bit, and then build it up high again, and then forward. And next thing you know, you're already up to the walls. By the 8th of Av, in other words, after 3 weeks of engineering, they were ready. Titus ordered the battering rams to be placed opposite the western portico of the outer court of sanctuary. So you're actually going to start to battering ram the walls of what we call the Azarim, the Ezra's Nashim, the outer part of the Beis HaMikdash itself. The previous 6 days before their arrival, the most powerful of the siege engines had incessantly battered the wall without results. And you and I know why, because we've been at the Kotel. You see how giant those stones are. And he says they made no impact on the huge and perfectly bonded stones. And that's the reason when you always go to the Beis HaMikdash and they show you, so look how big the stones are, and you think it's for fancy purposes, but it's not for fancy purposes, but for siege purposes. If it's done right, if it's done big enough, then it's more or less impervious to battering rams of those days. Another team of the Romans tried to undermine the foundations of the northern gates, and after great exertions, succeeded in levering out the outer stones. And that's another way of doing it, right? Undermine means literally that. You dig under the wall, and then you pull away that way. So no matter how big it is, you can get it from underneath. But the gate, which was hung on the inner stone, stood firm, and so that didn't work either. It was so powerfully built. Now, I repeat, these are the stones of the Beis Hamikdash itself, of the inner buildings. So, none of which is left today, none of it. And they were so big and powerful that the best Roman tactics couldn't succeed, until despairing of all attempts with engines and crowbars, they set up ladders against the porticos. So they said, we'll just have to storm them like the Alamo or something, just with ladders and try to get in there. But the Jews were in no hurry to intervene. But when the Romans climbed up, they vigorously attacked them. Some were thrust back and hurled down headlong. Others were encountered and slain. Many, as they stepped off the ladders, were unable to shield themselves with their shields and were cut down with their swords. Meaning the Roman attempts to storm the temple were not successful. Some ladders crowded with men were pushed sideways from above and thrown to the ground, not without inflicting heavy losses. Romans who brought up their flags fought fiercely around them, realizing it would be a terrible disgrace if they were captured. But eventually the Jews captured even the flags, the ensigns, which in the Roman army is a big no-no, and destroying all who mounted the ladders. The remainder of the Romans, demoralized by the fate of the fallen, withdrew. So to attack the place head-on didn't work, even though they were good at that. Of the Romans, no one died without having achieved something, etc., etc., etc. But then Titus, the Roman general, realized that his attempts to spare a foreign temple resulted in the injury and slaughter to his troops. He ordered the gates to be set on fire. So what you have over here is the picture of a powerful fortress, Beis Hamikdash, and it doesn't work, but it has gates which are really wood covered up with gold. So that's the weak link. Get it? That was beautiful, it was fancy, and he didn't want to do it, but he said, this is ridiculous, we got to do something. And so it's not a question of burning down the building, hear me well. It's a question of trying to get into the building if you can't get in through the stone door. And so, and he says, some Jews, what do you call it, surrendered by now, the troops were, so this is the 8th of Av. Now the troops were getting ready and set fire to the gates. The silver melted over quickly, and emitting the flames into the solid woodwork. So it must have been quite something. It's called the Shari Nikan or whatever. You can just imagine the fancy schmancy gates of the Beis Hamikdash itself, the Sha'arim as they call it, and it was covered, he said, with silver, all the rest of it, but fire will get rid of it. Whence it fastened into a dense mass onto the porticos. When the Jews saw the ring of fire, they lost all power of body and mind. Right? No, the idea that the Beis Hamikdash, any part of it is on fire, and as we all know, fire spreads. Plus, you tell me, we've all been in Yerushalayim, I'm sure everybody in this room, and tell me about winds. Correct? And it's hot, and it's dry, and it's summer, and it's windy. And so it's unfortunately perfect for a fire. Because of their consternation and terror, no one attempted to extinguish the flames. So the Jew was so shocked by the sight of any part of Beis Hamikdash there that they stood there. Thus, paralyzed, they stood looking on. Yet in their dismay at this destruction, they did not have the sense to preserve what was left intact, but increased their rage against the Romans. In other words, Josephus, who was a critic of the Jews, as you know, even though he was Jewish, he said, why did they surrender at that point? This is very tricky, because Josephus, as I'm sure many know, was captured by the Romans, went over to the Romans, but that doesn't mean he was wrong. The Chazal have the exact same opinion. They say in the Gemara in Gittin and in the Ovis Rav Nosson, when you're losing, it's no point. It's not the Japanese Eric here. You know, there's no point. Keep me fight. You know, it's just going to lead to destruction. But people were so fanatical. You understand? This is the trouble when people get hooked to an idea and they're not listening to anyone wiser than them. They say, we're going to fight them no matter what. I'm sure in their minds, they were expecting a divine miracle. You understand? That at the 99-yard line, at the last minute, Mashiach will come or something like that. But this was irresponsible. All through that day and the following night. So that's the 8th of Av, right? And last night, the night of Tisha B'Av. Yesterday, what I just described happened yesterday, and last night, the fire prevailed. For the whole range of the porticos could not be ignited at once, but only one segment after another. Which means the Beis Hamikdash was such a huge complex with so many fancy apartments that literally it took a long time for the fire to go to this part, consume it, and proceed to this part, and to this part. That's what happens over there. The next day, now I'm giving you his version of it. But this is, there was two versions of what exactly happened at Tisha B'Av, which is what we're all about. and they're not identical exactly. And I'll tell you, and the Maharal has something to say about this. The next day, Titus, having ordered a division of the army to put out the fire and make a road to the gates in order to facilitate the ascent of the legion, summoned his generals. And so the Romans, being, as I said before, professional experts, now that the gate is burned, you have to actually physically construct a road, right, a pathway, and then the army can march in. Okay? He called the generals, 62 generals, this general and that one and all the others, Fronto, this and the other, and he brought up the question of the fate of the sanctuary. So notice this is the morning of the 9th of Av, where we are right now. And what do? Some thought that the law of war should be enforced, since the Jews would not cease to rebel as long as the temple remained a rallying point for every quarter. So some said, let's destroy it. Others argued that if the Jews abandoned it and no one placed any weapons there, it should be saved. But in case it was mounted again for military purposes, it should be burned. For it then would be a fortress and not a sanctuary, and then the impious, would be blamed a lot to the Romans, those left in their choice. But Titus said that even if the Jews were to mount and fight from it, he would not make war on inanimate constructions, but only on men. Whatever happened, he would not burn down such a magnificent edifice, for the Romans would then lose thereby, and if preserved, the empire would gain a unique monument. Hold that thought later on when we get to the Maharal. So the generals, Fronto and these other guys, encouraged by this, came around to this point of view, and Titus adjourned the council and instructed the officers to allow the men time for rest, so they may find them full of vigor when fighting would be resumed, and he ordered to pick men from the cohorts to clear a road through the ruins and put out the fire. So here we are in the morning of Tisha B'Av. They held the council of war. They said, what should I do today? He said, let's not burn it, let's just fight our way in there and conquer it by military force. Showing exhaustion and shock had depressed the energy of the Jews through that day, and then the next. And that would sound like the tomorrow. They sallied out from the second hour, so it sounds like tomorrow, in the morning through the east gate and attacked the Romans who occupied the outer court of the temple. So basically, the Romans moved into what we call the Ezras Noshim, the outer part of the Beis HaMikdash proper, and the Jews who were in the inside of the Beis HaMikdash proper, which is where you have the regular Azara, where you have the altar and the Kodesh and Kodesh Kodashim, all those buildings, they charge out there to drive the Romans out and attack out of the Ezras Noshim part, right? And the Romans stood their ground and met the onslaught by sheltering beyond the solid wall of shields held out in front of them and closed their ranks. You know, like the turtle tactics. The Romans held the attack, but it was evident they couldn't offer all against the fanatical fury of the assailants who surpassed them in numbers. So we're fighting in the Beis HaMikdash, the outer part we call the Ezras Noshim, an attack of the Jews to try to push the Romans out. Caesar, meaning Titus, who watched the engagement from the Antonia, and I told you there was a fort right next to, adjacent to the Beis HaMikdash, so he's looking down and can see the whole thing, and anticipated the collapse of the line. He saw that the Romans are falling back from the Jewish attack, now rushed to their assistance with his picked horsemen. So it's like a movie, you know, the Romans counterattacked with cavalry. The Jews could not withstand the cavalry charge. This is a cavalry charge in the Ezras Noshim. And when the front ranks fell, the rest withdrew. Whenever the Romans drew back, they whipped around and pressed them hard, meaning then the Jews tried to counterattack. When these in turn wheeled around, they fell back and fled. This lasted to the 5th hour of the day when the Jews were overpowered and shut up in the inner temple courts. So basically, what he's trying to say is, the fights that took place at Ezras Noshim led with the Romans actually busting into the inner part of the temple. Okay. Titus retired to Antonia, and he went back to that fort where he had his office next door to the Beis HaMikdash, intending to launch a full-scale attack the following day at dawn and take possession of the temple. It must have been talking about the 9th of Av here. The sanctuary, however, which had long been condemned by God to the flames, and after passing, which is the same day the Bais was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar and Bais Rishon, now it was their own people who caused the start of the conflagration. For when Titus had withdrawn, the rebels attacked the Romans again. In other words, the Romans broke into the inner part, but then pulled out to have a full-scale attack the next day. And meanwhile, the Jews attacked the Romans, and a clash followed between the guards of the sanctuary, meaning the Jews, and the troops of putting out the fire inside the inner court, the Romans. And the latter routed the Jews. The Romans won that attack, but followed in hot pursuit right into the temple itself. Then one of the Roman soldiers, without waiting for any orders, and with no dread of so momentous a deed, but urged on by some supernatural force, snatched a blazing piece of wood, and climbing on the back of another soldier, hurled the flaming brand through a low golden window that gave access on the north side to the rooms that surrounded the sanctuary. Which means that he threw it and tossed it in to the huge building, what we call the Heichal, which of course contains the Kodesh and the Kodesh HaKadoshim, and a whole bunch of what they call Ta'im, some may know this from the Mishnayos, of rooms, dozens of rooms and offices that ran the inner brains of the base of English operation. Okay? So he just threw it like that, and it went into a window, into that beautiful building called the Heichal. As the flames shot up, the Jews let out a shout of dismay that matched the tragedy. They flocked to the rescue, with no one thought of sparing their own lives or husbanding the strength, for the sacred structure they constantly guarded with such devotion was vanishing before their very eyes. And if the Heichal is going up, there's a fire inside the Heichal itself, but you can just imagine what it was, like I said before. It's the month above, it's windy, it's all the rest of it, and there's a fire in there, and it's a building with a lot of stuff in it that's flammable. A runner brought the news to Titus while he rested in his tent after the battle. Okay, notice he's in the fortress next door. Leaping up as he was, he ran to the temple to extinguish the conflagration. He was followed by all his generals, and these in turn by the excited legionaries, with the shouting and confusing characteristic of such a disorganized rush by such a large force. Because this wasn't the plan. They were supposed to attack the next day, and then it just happened. Titus, both through force and raised hand, waved his combatants to put out the fire, but his shouts were not heard, as their ears were deafened by the overwhelming din, and his beckoning hand went unheeded amidst the distractions of the fight and the avenging fury. So it's basically the Romans went berserk. No exhortation or threat could now restrain the impetuosity of the Romans, for passion was in supreme command. Crowded together around the entrances, many Jews were trampled down by their companions. Others, stumbling onto the smoldering and smoke-filled ruins of the porticos, died as miserably as the defeated. So the Romans basically broke into the Azora. You know, there's the Mizbeach, and there behind it is the building of the Heichal, which is now on fire. It's a horrific scene. Whoever was stuck there, nobody figured they're going to break in right now. The fighting was on the outside. There were a lot of civilians, as you'll see, in the wrong place at the wrong time, as they say, and people are running crazy in one direction or another, trampling the older people, in the way. The Romans are stabbing people. As they drew closer to the temple, the Roman soldiers pretended not to hear Titus's orders, but urged the men in front of them to throw in more firebrands. The rebels, the Jews, were powerless to help. Carnage and flight spread throughout. Most of the slain were peaceful citizens, weak and unarmed, and they were butchered where they were caught. The heap of corpses mounted higher and higher around the altar. So, like I say, a lot of people were there didn't think anything was going to happen that day. A stream of blood flowed down the temple steps, and the bodies of those slain slipped to the bottom. There was so much blood that caused the bodies to fall down the steps. When Titus failed to restrain the fury of his frenzied soldiers, and the fire could not be checked, he entered the building with his generals and looked at the holy place of the sanctuary and all of its furnishings, which exceeded by far the accounts current in foreign lands, and fully justified their splendid repute in our own. So notice he says that Titus saw that it's over, that it's going to be burned, but before it goes, I want to see what it looked like. Understand? Even though smoke and crack, I heard so many things about the fancy base of meetings. And you know, and I know, this is why you have the story that goes and stabs the Baruchas in the Gemara. Okay? Zachor is asher asot tsar bifnim. Remember what the enemy did bifnim when he stabbed and came inside. But he comes in there when the place is already in smoke and on fire, and he wouldn't be able to say, I saw what it looked like before it went out. As the flames...
How come he wanted to extinguish the fire?
Well, according to him, he wanted to spare such a pretty building.
Just for...
No, he has respect for religious institutions. That's this version over here. That's what they say here. As the flames had not yet penetrated to the inner sanctum, right? In other words, the building is going to go, but the fire's on the outside, so it hasn't reached the inside yet. But we're consuming the chambers that surrounded the sanctuary. And again, I remind you, I know many people know this from the Mishnayos, that the building of the Heichal had ta'im, lots of little rooms in the wall, lots and lots of little rooms, whole bunches of them. Each were different offices, and one after another is being, you know how fire spreads. Titus assumed correctly there was time to save the structure, Right? He said, maybe he can save with the inner part of the building. He ran out and by personal appeals attempted to persuade his men to put out the fire, instructing a centurion of his bodyguard of lancers to club any of the men who disobeyed his orders, but their respect for Titus and their fear of the centurion's staff, who was trying to check them, was overpowered by their own rage, their detestation of the Jews, and by the utterly uncontrolled lust for battle. Okay. Most of them were spurred on by the expectation of loot, convinced that the interior was full of money, and dazzled by observing that everything around them was made of gold. Obviously, no Roman had ever been inside the Hichel. Okay. That's how fancy it was. But they were forestalled by one of those who entered into the building. In other words, but any chance of saving the inside was stopped, who, when Caesar dashed to retrain the troops, pushed a firebrand of darkness into the hinges of the gate. There was another Roman soldier threw it inside the building, not on the outside, but the in part. And then when the flames suddenly shot up from the interior, Titus and his generals withdrew, and no one was left to prevent those outside from kindling a blaze. So the soldier was uncontrollable, according to this version, and they're throwing fire everywhere, and that's it. So in defiance of the siege, the temple was set on fire. And then he says like this, when the temple was ablaze, the attackers plundered it, and countless Jews who were caught by them were slaughtered. There was no pity for age, and no regard for his accorded rank. Children and old men, laymen and priests alike were butchered. Every class was pursued and crushed in the grip of war, whether they cried for mercy or offered resistance. Through the roar of the flames streaming far and wide, the groans of the falling victims was heard. Such was the height of the Hertzbergs and the magnitude of the blazing pile that the entire city seemed to blaze, and the noise, well, nothing more deafening or frightening could be imagined. There were the war cries of the Roman legions as they swept onwards en masse, charging, the yells of the Jews circled by fire and sword, the panic of the people who cut off above fled into the arms of the enemy, and their shrieks as they met their fate. The cries of the hill blended with those of the multitudes in the city below. There were parts of Yerushalayim that still were held by the Jews, and that's also, if you look up, you see the base of Mesh being destroyed. And you hear the terrible, you see exactly what's going on. So you have the screams on the top of the base of English, you have the screams coming up from the valley of Yerushalayim itself, and now many people who were exhausted and tongue-tied as a result of hunger, the Jews who had been suffering from hunger and thirst, we'll talk about that later, terrible hunger and thirst, but they now had enough energy to scream with horror at the sight of the temple burning. When they beheld the temple on fire, found strength once again to lament and will. Perea and the surrounding hills added their echoes to the deafening din, and the areas around Yerushalayim, we all know it's a hilly area, and you all know that you can actually see Yerushalayim from very far away. Isn't that true? In Eretz Yisrael, you can even see it. You can see Jerusalem from Jordan, correct? On a clear day, you can see from across the Jordan River. That's Perea. So, this is just a terrible scene. Here's a Jewish community that's far away from what's going on. Let's say during the Ever Yarden, okay, and they've already been occupied by the Romans or whatever, and it's the 9th of Av, so it's August or something, and it's a clear day, and you don't have to be an idiot. You see the fire, and then you tell what's going on from far away, and then you run home and say, "Mom, look at this." It's just it is what it is. And as he says over here, more horrifying than the din were the sufferings. The Hertzbergs, everywhere enveloped in flames, seemed to be boiling over from its base. Yet the blood was more abundant than the flames, and the number of slain was greater than those of the slayers. The ground could not be seen anywhere between the corpses. The soldiers climbed over heaps of bodies as they chased the fugitives. The rebel horde, meaning the Jews, managed with difficulty to break through the Romans, known as some of the Jewish soldiers, and to break through the outer courts of the base of English and from there to the city. And so some Jews, fighters, didn't give up. They fought their way out of the Hertzbergs and ran into the part of Yerushalayim which was still not held by the Romans, while the surviving population took refuge on the outer porticos. Some of the Kohanim first tore out from the temple roof the spikes with their lead sockets and hurled them at the Romans. Again, some of you, I know, have seen the Mishnah, used to have these spikes on the top of the base to make so birds wouldn't land there. Okay? So they tried to throw it at the Romans, but subsequently they didn't achieve anything, and the flames came towards them. They withdrew into a wall which was 8 cubits wide, and stayed there too, and this happened. The Romans did make it useless to spare the surrounding buildings now that the temple was in flames. In other words, if the Heichel is going up, then when they need the other buildings that were part of the complex called the Beis HaMikdash, and they set fire to all of them, both the remains of the porticos and all the gates except for 2, east and south gates, which were later demolished. They burned also the treasury chambers, which contained huge sums of money, vast quantities of clothes, and other precious belongings. Here, in fact, was a general depository of Jewish wealth, where the rich had brought the contents of their dismantled homes for safekeeping. They used to be like the place you keep your stuff. They now reached the last surrounding portico of the outer court, on top of which poor women and children, a population and a mixed multitude of 6,000 had found refuge. But before Titus could give any orders, the soldiers, carried away in their fury, set fire to the porticos below, and they were all killed as they threw themselves into the flames, and whoever was not was killed by the Roman soldiers. The people owed their destruction. Now, why were so many people, civilians, on a Tuesday or whatever, in the Beis HaMikdash, when typically speaking, it's supposed to be that the public only goes there on a Yom Tov or whatever. On a typical day in Beis HaMikdash, it's Kohanim, right, running the place and doing the karbanos and all that. The people owed their destruction to a false prophet who on that very day declared to the people that God ordered them to go to the Hertzbergs to receive the signs of their deliverance. I mentioned this the other day. Somebody came up and said, today's Mashiach here. In Echanami, the enemy's up to the last line. This is exactly when the Gula is going to happen, right? And unfortunately, many people believe them, and they ran up to the Hertzbergs, and they're whatever. Many prophets induced the people by the rebel leaders to deceive the people. He says that the political leaders had told people to give these rumors out, whatever the case is. And so we have, as I say before, the terrible scene over here of this, and then we have the Romans have a triumph. As the rebels fled the city, flames were consuming the sanctuary. The Romans brought their standards into the temple court, their flags, and erecting them opposite the eastern gate, they sacrificed to them there because they won. And with thundering acclamations hailed Titus as an emperor, as a victorious general. So laden with plunder was every soldier that throughout Syria the value of gold went down a half. Right? When the priests were still holding in the outer wall of the sanctuary, there was a kid who tried to get him out, and they ended up killing them all. And the other priests were all killed by them. And this is the immediate part. I'll tell you a little bit later about the aftermath of this. Now, according to this, as you see, which is the most detailed description, obviously, around, we have a blow-by-blow. It's pretty bad, of course. One can just imagine what Tisha was. I mean, it's horrifying. But he says that Titus didn't want to destroy the Beis HaMikdash. You and I also know, I don't have to read it from the Gemara, everybody here is familiar with it, that the Gemara says when Titus went into the Kodesh HaKadoshim, he stabbed the paroches and it bled, right? And not only that, he brought in the Zona to do it in front of the Beis HaMikdash with in the Kodesh HaKadoshim as a sign of contempt, okay? And so, what's is going on over there? The Kina we're going to recite is again one based not on Josephus but on different Chazals, and so obviously he's going to emphasize the passages that one finds in the Gemara and in the Midrashim, which in their way, their stylized form, try to bring out certain aspects of this. For example, he says, remember what the enemy did when he got inside, Shalom Charba, he pulled out a sword of Baal Lifnei, went inside the Kodesh HaKadoshim, in the context that we just described. He was Metame the Lechem upon him. I don't know if he was Metame exactly the Lechem upon him. Yeah, I mean, if he came in there, and he busted in, and it was unexpected, sure, there was the menorah, the Lechem upon him, the Mizbach HaKetoras, all the things that one would find typically in there. V'gida Paroches, and he sliced the Paroches. Yeah, sure, if he walked in Kodesh Kadoshim, with his thing, Yisom Gilbam Ogam Adam, and he killed Yisomim with a red shield. Okay, I mean, we just saw that. Vayimadi Kov Tamari Adamdam, and measured them from death along a blood-red line. We'll see in a minute, or a little bit later, besides what I just described to you, there's what's called the aftermath of Tisha B'Av, in which you have the POWs who were massacred and left standing for days in the Temple Mount, waiting their fate, dying from thirst and things like this. He filled his sword, his arrows with blood. He left the house full of blood, and all the rest. Now, many know the story that Titus figured they killed God or something like that. And at least that's the way the Medrash puts it. And then a bug went up the nose and drove him crazy the rest of his life. Correct? The gnat that went up the nostrils of Titus and bugged it literally, and eventually led to his death. This is a whole portion of itself, but you all have the English, I know, so you'll see as they go through bit by bit in this sort of the stylized poem, he's going to talk about the entry of the Romans into the Temple Mount, and the women terrified, and the princes cringing in fear, and always the python asking, why is God doing this? And the answer is always, it's our sins. And he mentions over here the fact that they're going to send the victims back to Rome to be prisoners, and that's the story again. I know we all know where they jump off, the boys and the girls jump off the ship on the way there. All these are brought into here, as I said before, in a poetic form. The Maharal of Prague, I showed this to someone before. And you may wish today, Tisha especially, you may wish to take a look at this. See, this is called Be'er Agola. The Maharal of Prague wrote lots of form. The Doris will translate one or two. And Be'er Agola is very famous. And this is not an exact translation, which is good for you, because it's not very repetitive, but it's an English rendition of it. Okay? And without going into too many details, he deals with strange agaritas. There's some people are challenged and whatever, strange agaritas. And one of them, in his style, and one of them has to do with the chapters he puts in, which is the bug that went up the nose of Titus, the gnat that killed Titus. And the morale in general starts out by saying that what's going on over here, because some will object that Josephus describes a much more benevolent Titus who objected to the destruction based in English, and yet the Gemara is giving you somebody who obviously he took his own into Kodesh B'Dashim, and he stabbed the purpose, all the rest of it, wanted to destroy the base of Mikdash. And how do you work all that out? Josephus, I read you his original Josephus. There's a Frum version of it called Yosefon, and that's where the Maharal and the others are getting from, because they all used to read Yosefon. And he describes the same thing I just told you over there, and he tries to explain in his own way, basically, very complex, that Titus wanted to hold the base image, but obviously use it for his own purposes afterwards. So that was the idea, and God wouldn't let that happen. That's the Maharal's basic interpretation over there. In history, they said that Titus died from an illness. Don't say anywhere a bug went up his nose. And there was a famous rabbi, Rabbi Rossi, who said it's a legend, and the Maharal is blasting him for saying it's a legend. But the Maharal himself ends up saying that when the bug went up the nose, it was another name for a brain tumor. He lived 500 years ago. They didn't use those terms, but that's what, if you take the trouble to read it, you'll see it's a little thing that metastasized. That's the meaning that the bug got bigger and bigger. By the time it was excruciating pain, and by the time it was over, it was like a bird with iron beaks. Basically, like a certain brain tumor. You understand? Now, what's the point of all this? The Romans wanted to say, of course, that it's all the Jews' fault. But the truth of the matter is that there's plenty of fault the Jews had, but the Romans also plenty of fault. And the Chazal are interested in emphasizing, when they talk about the Churban Bayit Sheni, yeah, we had our sin, no question about it, but the Romans' activity was inexcusable. So now when we're going to be reading, and you have the English in front of you, along with the Hebrew, all the famous descriptions, whether it's of the stabbing of the Proches, or whether it's the massacres that were just described in detail, or whether it's the fate of the boys and the girls afterwards, or similar sorts of, or where he defiles the Lechem Aponim or the other parts in the base of Mikdash. Josephus doesn't give you details. You tell me what happens when the Roman soldiers get into an area where you had Nesachim, and Carbonos, and the Besamim, and all these things are Kodesh. and Kodesh Kadoshim, and obviously they were, destroyed or violated. I mean, it goes without saying. And of course, in the end, the Romans hold a triumph. So, in that regard, let's now see how the Relessa Kalir we will recite now the remembrance of those days. The Chorash also, all the reasons anybody comes up with always fails when you try to explain why the children are a normal thing, unless you just say they're suffering from the sins of the parents. The next Akina has to do with an aspect. As I say, the first one we did was the Bayis Rishon, the second destruction of Bayis Sheni, and now I get into the details. In both cases, one of the worst aspects is the starvation. And no one should ever know such thing, obviously. The starvation is the main theme of the book of Eichel, correct? That we read last night, where he says, "Tovim hoyu chalichem mechal micharov." Isn't that right? That those who died a quick death with a sword is better off than those who died a slow death with the starving. We live in a world today that, listen, there's starving going on now in the world, so you can just imagine what like then. Plus, the sieges in the summer, you know what Yerushalayim's like, the hot and all that, is really tough. And it goes into great detail, which is why it results ultimately in cannibalism. That's what I'm talking about here. You can't judge anybody, but this happens. Okay? Well, it's not long ago, by the way. In Stalin's Russia, the starvation of people ate people. It happens. Okay? And if you know the Tanakh, by the way, you will know that in the Bayis Rishon period, there's a story told in the Book of Kings when the city of Shomer, which was the capital of the northern kingdom of the 10 tribes, was besieged by the army of Aram, and they're starving there. And two women go to the king, and they have a din Torah, so to speak. They weren't from. The two women go to the king, and here's the argument: last night we ate my kid. She promised that today she'd eat hers, and now she don't want to deliver them up. That's cheating. When the king hears, tears their clothes, and this is what people do. Okay? And such stories are told in the Medrash Rabbah that we'll do later on in the afternoon. And once again, Josephus himself has a very detailed account of what he calls a famous or horrific example of the starvation that took place over here. And I'll tell you, be shocked, even though I read over here, but it is what it is. And as he puts it over here, now mind you, the Gemara talks about this as well. And again, I assume that people remember, and I think most of us do, the Kamsa bar Kamsa stories. Remember the lady who sent her servant to get bread, and he said they didn't have this type of bread to go to the other one, but then there was nothing, correct? And that they, Yochanan ben Zakkai saw a rich little girl eating from the dung of the donkey, looking to pick food out. And what starvation does to people, they can eat anything, So we have such stories anymore. And it was because of the starvation that Yochanan ben Zakkai in the Gemara says, let's surrender. They want to kill him. So this is a basic feature that's established by all the sources. But Josephus puts it in a gross detail because he says over here that the different zealot groups, which the Gemara calls the Beryonim, were out that anybody who would show the slightest sign of wanting to surrender, we kill him horribly. And he says that for the wealthy it was just as fatal. He says the poor tried to run out of the city if they could. Some were caught by the Romans and killed, some like that. And for the wealthy it was just as fatal to remain in the city, for on the pretext that one was a deserter, many a man was killed for the sake of his property. And, it's the easiest thing in the world to say, I want this guy's house. He's a traitor, let's kill him, now I get the house. As the famine grew worse, the frenzy of the insurgents kept pace with it, and every day both of these horrors burned more fiercely. For since there was nowhere was food to be seen, men would break into houses, in other words, Jewish soldiers would break into houses, and if they found some food, they mistreated the occupants for having denied their possession of the food, and if they found none, they tortured them as if they had concealed it more carefully. Where are you hiding it? Proof whether or not food was had was provided by the physical appearance of the wretches. Those in good condition were deemed to be well provided with food, while those who were seen already wasting away were passed over, for it was pointless to kill people who were going to die from starvation anyway. Many secretly bartered all their possessions for a single measure of wheat, for this much. If they happen to be rich, barley if poor. If you think this is something from long ago, Osher's not here now. You don't know, in the Second World War you had this. Right? The Jews gave away diamonds and just for a piece of bread. Then they shut themselves up in the darkest corners of their houses. In other words, people would give away their most valuable possession to get a little bit of grain or something like this, and then hide, nobody should see you eating it, in the dark corner in the house. In the extremity of hunger, some ate the grain even unground, while others baked it, guided by necessity and fear. Now, there's others, I can't eat it unless I make it in some kind of bread. I'll just take my chances. So driven by hunger, I got to eat something, I'll bake this, and if somebody smells it, it happens. Nowhere was a table laid. The food was snatched, half cooked from the fire, and torn into pieces. Pitiful was the fare, and worthy of tears, the spectacle, for while the strong had more than enough, the weak could only whimper. And this is what happened when we have a chaos society. The gangs. This is Jews and Jews. This is Yerushalayim. The gangs had the power, the weapons, and they could dominate everybody else. All human emotions yield to hunger, but nothing of it so destructive as that of shame. And what at other times would claim respect is in time of famine treated with contempt. And this is totally true. On myself, to tell you, I've said before, my father was in Dachau in early 45, and in the barracks, in the concentration camp, and a fight broke out between two starving people, and they had to pull the two apart from each other. That was in the bunk. And each one trying to strangle the other like this. It was a father and a son. Strangle each other. Because the father was trying to kill the son. Why? Because the son stole the father's last piece of bread. You see? And that's what he means over there. That what at other times would claim respect is in time of famine treated with contempt. That's why I say one should never know this. You're driven to crazy. You can't blame anybody. You're driven to crazy things. Thus it was that wives snatched food from their husbands, children from fathers, and most pitiful of all, mothers out of the very mouths of their infants. For while their dearest ones were dying in their arms, they did not hesitate to deprive them of the life-giving morsels. We're going to read now in Tochal Nenoshim Periam Aval Aili. This is what he's talking about. Okay? But this way of satisfying their hunger did not go unnoticed. Wherever the Jewish soldiers hovered ready to snatch away even these pickings, whenever they saw a house with locked doors, they immediately concluded everybody inside was taking food, and bursting the doors open, they rushed in and forced the bits of food out of their very jaws. That brought them up again. They beat old men who were clutching their victuals. They dragged women by their hair as they concealed what they had in their hands. They had no pity for gray hair of infants, but picked them up as they clung to their scraps, and they dashed them on the ground. So they saw a kid holding a piece of a thing, and the soldier wanted to say, he takes like this and throws the kid on the ground. Starvation. If anyone anticipated their entry by gulping down what they hoped to siege, they were savage. The soldiers were even more savage, as if they had been defrauded. One would shudder hearing of the methods of torture they devised in their search for food. I say it again, this is Jew and Jew. They blocked up the vents of the orifice of the poor victims' bodies. You know what that means, right? They plugged them up, as it were. Where they drove sharp stakes up in the posteriors. They inflicted on people tortures and torments untold. For what? To make them admit the possession of a loaf, or to reveal the hiding place of a handful of barley meal. It was not that the tormentors were hungry, then it would explain, but this is their way of keeping their passions exercised. When men crawling out at night as far as the Roman lines to gather wild herbs and grasses. And people do this. My father, in the concentration camp, ate grass. He said, when you're starving, I asked him once, how do you do this? If it tastes bitter, you spit it out. If it doesn't taste so bitter, you swallow it. I said, right? This is a necessity. They would go out, the soldier would go out and meet them, and just at the moment they thought they were safe from the Roman lines, they would snatch what they procured. So here's a guy sneaking out there to get some grass, and come back, and then the Jews take it from them. And often, though their victims implored them, even appealing in the sacred name of God, to leave them a fraction of what they had collected at their own risk, not a morsel was given back. They were lucky if they were merely robbed and not killed as well. And as he says over here, it's the utter degradation. Unfortunately, it was the utter degradation of the Jewish race, because starvation makes people do, as I said, things that are typically unthinkable. And then he says, as the famine went on, up to Tisha B'Av, countless numbers fell victim to famine. The city's sufferings they endured were unspeakable. In every home, the very shadow of food led to conflict. And the closest relatives came to blows, snatching from each other any pitiful means of sustenance. Not even the dying were believed to be in want of food, and even those expiring were searched by brigands in case any of them had food hidden inside their clothing and were faking death. The desperate ruffians stumbled and staggered along like mad dogs, open mouthed with hunger, battering at the doors like drunken men, and in their helpless confusion bursting into the same house 2 or 3 times in a single hour. Necessity drove them to gnaw at everything, and objects which not even the filthiest dumb animals would look at, they picked up and ate. So the Gemara says this about the picking the dung out of the food out of the dung. In the end, they did not stop at eating belts and shoes. They stripped off the leather from their shields and they gnawed at it. Some tried to live on scraps of old hay, and there were people who collected stalks and sold a tiny bunch of hay stalks for 4 anna drachmas, which is another like $400. But why should I go on to describe the inanimate things that hunger made them unashamed enough to eat? I will now describe an act in which there is no parallel in the annals of Greece, a horrible and unspeakable deed, and one incredible to hear. I hope I will not be suspected by posterity of grotesque invention, and would gladly have passed over this calamity in silence had there not been countless contemporary witnesses to bear me out. Right? And my country would have little reason to thank me if I suppressed the narrative of the horrible miseries that it had to endure. And this is in the Medrash as well, the Medrash Nation. And he says there was a woman named Miriam, daughter of Elazar, who lived in the Jordan east of the village of Suva, Beth Azov, distinguished in family and fortune, who had fled with the rest of the people to Yerushalayim, where she became engulfed in a siege. Most of her property, which she had packed up and brought from her from Perea to the city, had been plundered by the tyrants. In other words, the Jewish soldier, whatever, different factions had taken over the Chassan. The remnants of her treasures, any food she had managed to procure, were stolen day by day by their henchmen. So she had been rich, but it wasn't now. Full of indignation, the wretched woman kept on abusing and cursing the extortioners and aroused their anger. So every day people came and robbed her, and she cursed them and screamed at them, but didn't mean anything. They didn't pay attention to her. But no one, either out of resentment or pity, put her to death as she wished. Weary of providing food for others when it was impossible to find anywhere, and while hunger ravaged her internal organs and marrow, and rage consumed her even further, she finally yielded to the promptings of fury and necessity and defied nature itself. Seizing her baby, the baby at the breast, she cried, "Why should I keep you alive amidst war, famine, and civil strife? We will only face slavery with the Romans, even if we survive until they arrive. But famine will forestall slavery, and the rebels, meaning the Jews, are more cruel than either famine or slavery. You be my food, and an avenging omen for the partisans, and to the world the only tale yet untold of Jewish misery." And so saying, she killed her son, roasted him and ate half, concealing and saving the rest. The partisans, the soldiers, and those appeared at once, attracted by the odor, and threatened that unless she produced what she had prepared, she would be killed on the spot. She replied, she had saved us, fine a helping for them, and disclosed the remnants of her child. Overcome with instant horror and stupefaction, they stood immobile at the sight, and she said, "This child is my own, and so is this deed. Come eat, I have done so. Don't be softer than a woman or more tender-hearted than a mother. But if you're pious and do not approve of my sacrifice, then I have eaten in your behalf, and let me keep the rest." And they left trembling, for once cowards, there was some reluctance. And the starving people desired to, this is, okay. So this is just, it happened to be a well-known story. But I don't know if it's unique. And it's certainly not unique in by Rishon period. I'll say it again. The book of Eicha is mainly about this. When the Babylonians captured the city, it was actually captured not in a storm and attack. It surrendered. The Romans did it in an attack, as you see. But the starvation was common to both. And as we read, and therefore I don't think it's necessary to go through all the details as we recite the next keynote into Chana, Josh, Imperium, my life, women who ate their fruit of their womb, woe is to me, except of course that, let's put it this way. So where is God in all this? Why is this all happening? And that you find on the keynotes. And at the end of the keynote, you'll see that the Ruach HaKodesh says like this, you forget it. You don't remember why this happened. This happened for nothing. See, in Tessalafta, the Ruach HaKodesh L'mol Merim, when the end of the keynote says the Ruach HaKodesh answers them, Hay al Shchei Aron, Woe to bad neighbors, meaning Mashikuram Modim is a Shosel Modim. Bad neighbors complain about what's done to them, but they never tell you what they do to you. Okay? In Techal Nanoshin Pir Mashmim, you talk about the fact that I reduced the Jews to cannibalism, but you don't talk about the fact that you killed the Zachariah, the priest, in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, everybody went along with it. Notice that you did things to violate God's laws, and you're only saying that God violates your laws. This is the reply that we find in the Kinos, that it was the Averos of the Jews that lead to this, and if you say like this, how does one match the other? It means you didn't understand how terrible a thing it is to do an Averos. That's what he answers. So, in that regard, let us now recite this keynote over here on page 238. Here, this is included in there for a different aspect of the Churban, of Tisha B'Av in general. And that is what we call Misa Sitzidim. In other words, throughout history, you have cases where the Torah itself is under attack, and where famous Torah scholars are killed. The 10 of the Romans, but of course, you don't need me to tell you, down the ages in Europe and all these other places, it's a basic feat. Let me give you an example. How many great Rabbi were killed in the Holocaust? Some of them got out, some did not get out. My father lived in Shavel, Lithuania. The Rav there was boxed. They split his skull with an axe the first day or something like that. So, nothing to talk about. Not the Germans, the Litvaks. So when the German army came in, they was learning, if I remember the story correctly, just chopped it open. Now, and very, very common, okay? Very common, unfortunately. And the theme here is that I thought if you're a big scholar, you should be saved. Yeah? But that's not true. Okay? Already from the time of the Romans, we have the famous stories, as you know, where one reason or another, the leading rabbis are killed, and not only killed, tortured. Isn't that right? It's not just killed, they're tortured. You know Rabbi Kiva was tortured with the iron combs, and the story of he's ripped off the skin to save it for the woman before they killed him. Horrible things. We all know Chanim Mitrad is burned at the stake with the wool. I mean, why do they tell you all this? And first of all, you can't avoid it. We all know, for example, one of the leading rabbis, Elisha ben Avuya, switched. He cracked under the pressure. Wait a minute. And not only did he become not religious, but he became pro-Roman, and he worked for the Romans to finger the other rabbis to get him killed. He went to chaters, hidden away, like in Russia, and he said, here's a chater, take him out and kill him. So how could somebody who was a Tana, on the one hand, go so much, they would actually go out and deliberately try to kill the other ones? If you tell me he lost his faith, and he lost the Dera, that's one thing. But if you go, they actually was actively involved in trying to kill the others who formerly even adhered to the Torah. And in other words, this is obviously a pathological kind of reaction. And many know some of the 4 or 5 different versions of what it was that drove Elisha ben Avuya to this state. For example, many are familiar with the story that he saw a father who sent the son up to get shiluch hakein, to get the eggs, and the son fell down, cracked his neck, and died. And so he said, "Whoa, that's impossible." It was kibbut of aim and the shiluch hakein and the terms of it must be your God. That's one version of it. Another version is the mystical one. He's one of the 4 people who went into Pardes, and he couldn't handle that, and he became a heretic. Okay? And there's other opinions. But the one that always struck me, in Yerushalmi I think it is that he saw the tongue of Chutzvah Samaturgaman lying in the ground and being eaten by dogs. So Chutzvah Samaturgaman, one of the 10 martyrs. There's Rabbi Kiva, Rabbi Shmuel, and Chanai ben Tradian, and Rabbi ben Bava. They list them all over there. And perfectly honestly, it didn't happen at one time. Everybody knows, even though they presented like at one time, it really happened on different occasions. But the idea of the Chazal over here is, who cares when the Romans killed him? But the point is that the Romans killed him. And Chutz Maturgaman was Tana, And that means he was a maturgamon, that is to say, he gave over the shir, as it were. Rosh Hashiva was to set it over in brief terms, and he explains. He was a renowned tzaddik, and how could God do such a thing? Like you asked him before. These are all questions of theodicy. How could little children get killed? How could great people, who didn't do anything wrong, they tried their best, and not only get killed, but if he drowned, no. But the Romans chopped out his tongue, which was the tongue that said the Torah, and now it's eaten by dogs in the streets. You understand? These strain, in other words, the credulity, and they go to the very heart of of the questions of Tisha B'Av, which are brought in here. Why does God do a thing like this? And the answer, of course, is always going to be, you have no idea how bad Averas are. And the opposite, the way you're supposed to look at it is that the punishment that you see gives you a little bit of idea how bad the Averas are. That's the firm approach. And because, hear this well, because these are all encapsulated in this particular stylized version, the point is always brought out that none of this is happening as coincidence. Gzeir Himmel funny, as you read over here, that God tells him this is Gzeir, this has to be. And there's meaning to the death, whether it's meaning to atone for the others or anything of that nature. I'll tell you again, we do not understand today, in my opinion, the centrality of the notion that the Jews are all one group and one's responsible for the other, and they're the good and the bad and this and that and the other, and it's not strange to a Jew from long ago, although it is strange to us today, that this person did a Avera and this will get punished. We don't really view ourselves as part of a body. You see, we've lost that in the last couple hundred years. But that's the way they saw it at that time. You see? You know, today, a person can get an infection in the toe, especially before penicillin, and could get killed from that. What's that got to do? I'm up here, the toe's down there. What's it got to do with the other? Maybe you tell them like this, you chop off the toe. But what's it got to do with the rest of the body? But we know this is because it's a one body, so what happens in one place can spread, automatically affect the others. They see over here in the martyrdom of the Tanoim, therefore, the archetype for the fact that you just get used to it. Tisha B'Av, we're going to be remembered that it's not only the bad Jews that get killed. When Gezeras happen, and we've had plenty of them, it's the good and the bad. To use the expression that's popular today, Hitler didn't ask any question, was he Orthodox, Reform, Conservative, this, that, and the other. And, but at the same time, it hammers home the point that we're all one group. And today, a person will say like this, just because a Reformed Jew did this, why should I be punished? Or vice versa. Just because I did something this, why should a Reconstruction Jew be affected? And in spite of what everybody says today, this is what we believe. The most powerful example of this we have today is Israel. Even though the groups are all fighting each other over there, but history, the last 60 years, has so managed that God has so organized the world that the Israelis are very aware that they either hang together or they don't. Right? Whether they like it or not, the Arabs want to get them all. That's what it is. And therefore, they got to work it out, and they're very aware that if a frum Jew Israeli kills someone, he really is an attack on everybody. And don't think that, it's only going to be the Chilonim or this and that and the other. They want to get everybody. You understand? And you say, but this person is so righteous and so Shomer Shabbos that they're saying, nobody's safe. Rabbi Kippur was also righteous. You know? Chutz from Turkey was a bigger tzaddik than people we have today. But if you don't know how to properly assess it, then you'll end up ending up like Elisha ben Avuya, who had to live through a life in which he went through this phase, and then he got past it, and then he could never live with himself again. Knowing what he did, I'm sure many people know the story, that in his old age, he changed his mind from being so anti-Jewish, and he just was horrified at himself, and even though Rabbi Meir buddied up with him as a student, Rabbi Meir said, I know you know so much Talmud to learn from you. Rabbi Meir constantly throughout the Gemara is always saying to his master, what? Repent. You know, because you're in the Torah, that teshuvah you do for anything. And what does the master tell him? I heard in heaven, shuv b'nei shom chutz mi'acher. what I've done is beyond repentance. Yeah? This is how he has to live with himself the rest of his life. And so as we do the Arzei, one of the famous stories I don't have to tell you, you know also what they did to Rabbi Kiva, and this one, and the other one, we pay attention to the fact, our attention is called to the fact that we're not simply dealing with the story over here, but we're also dealing with the phenomenon of tzaddikim and tzikonios, male women, who have been destroyed by our enemies down the ages, even though they didn't do anything wrong, right? Or if they did something wrong, it's pretty darn minute. You know, the Medrash tells us, it's a Tosefta actually, that when two of these martyrs, I think it was Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, because of Shimon Gamliel, the second was a member of the Revolutionary Tribunal. Josephus has this. You know, when they set up the government against the Romans, one of the big machos was Shimon Gamliel, and he was a moderate, and he wanted to call the war off, and they wouldn't listen to him, and the Romans eventually kill him. And Tosefta tells us that when they took him both about to be executed, they were asking themselves, what did we do wrong that we should be executed in such a horrible way? And the best thing, does anybody remember the best thing he could come up with? He says, did anybody ever come to ask you a shiloh and you said, come back later on when I finish sleeping on Shabbos afternoon? Oh. If that's the worst you could come up with, then you see the type of people that we're dealing with. And that is clear. We'll now recite the famous Arzei Elavon. Arzei Elavon Nadiri Torah, Bali Trace of the Mishnah Gemara. Ibari Korach Hamaleh of Torah, Dama Nishba V'Nosha. So it now was. You have to pay close attention because I bunched four together, which are scattered, and they're all about the Crusades. There's no reason for them to be scattered. It just was in there, you know, in the old Kino system. But Achrish Menamit and Rosh Hashanah, Mardi Shemel, are all the same thing. And these are the four kinos that we studied, have a total of 60 from the First Crusade. I just spent 5 weeks talking about here in Shul in the lecture series. Let's put it this way. The commemoration of the Crusades took place, it happened in the summer. We decided to stick it onto Tisha B'Av. And it says over here in one of the kinos that we're going to recite, and we're going to do all four, in one of the kinos we're going to recite, that it says, you're not supposed to make a new holiday like the Chazanish, so let's put it on Tisha B'Av. It says that, right? You're not supposed to make a new fast day, we're going to stick it on Tisha B'Av. And Bernie mentioned to me before an interesting insight, which is, I never thought about it, which is that the idea of sticking on Tisha B'Av, then it'll stay. Because if you rely on another day, guess what? After a few generations, it doesn't mean anything anymore. My kids, and certainly grandkids, the Shoah doesn't mean what it is to people in my generation. That's just the way it is. You understand? If you grew up from the war, right after the war, so that's one thing. If you grow a generation or two later, it's as old to them like the Inquisition is. You know, I mean, that's the way people are built. There's exceptions, of course, but generally speaking, time works relentlessly to weaken the bonds of pain. It's a good thing, you know, but it is what it is. And consequently, if you make another date, it'll eventually go into desuetude. Like Tisha B'Av, what's that?
Like Chof Sivan.
That's right, I was going to say. In the Second Crusade, during the time of the Second Crusade, there was an incident, or a little before actually, in Blois, in France, where a bunch of Jews were burned at the stake. Very unusual. A bunch of Jews were burned at the stake on charge of Alilas Dam, ritual murder. They killed a kid. And of course it wasn't true, but they were all killed, and they could have saved their lives, but they all chose to die and be burned alive. And Rabbeinu Tam was alive at that time, and he said that what they did was a big thing, and therefore they should be commemorated. Their Yortzim make a separate day, Chof Sivan, the 20th of Sivan, the Yom of Kedesh Blois. And they kept it up for a while, a couple hundred years, and later on, in 500 years later, that was when they decided to make it also the day for Khmelnytsky, for the Gzeres Tachvatat, meaning that when the Kazakhs killed all those Jews, like I spoke about last summer, so one of the towns, Nemirov, was wiped out on the Chof Sivan, and so after the whole massacres were over, the Gedolim, as they say in Poland, got together and they said we want to have a day like our own Yom HaShoah to commemorate all those Jews who were killed by the Cossacks, and let's do it on Chav Sivan, because we're not inventing that day. It's already there from Rabbeinu time. And something terrible did happen on Chav Sivan, and the Jews in that city, Nemiriv, all had the opportunity, if they wanted to, they could have converted and saved their lives. So everybody did that, okay, Hashem, that's a fact. It's not like Hitler, where you had no choice, they're going to kill you no matter what. All the people in the Crusades and all the people in the Khmelnytsky could, each and every one of them, could have saved their lives if that's what they wished to do. And in spite of it, they said, Shema Yisrael, and we're going to die. And so, Chav Sivan became a day for hundreds of years was observed. But, as this point, but you never heard of it. Because after a while, it fades away. The only people I know today, to my knowledge, that keep it up are the Oberlanders or something. You know, there's a few groups that still keep up that kind of date. So, on the other hand, if you stick it on Tisha B'Av is something that's a basic part of the Jewish calendar. And that's what they mentioned over there, that after the Crusades, they said they want to put it on the Jewish calendar. Here we have, as I say before, 4 kinos, 4 poems, which give in stylized poetic form, but described over here recently in the series in gory detail. That the Jews were living well in the Rhineland, and then and one particular group, wasn't even real crusaders, to be perfectly honest. One mob came down there, and they simply went down the Rhine. They went after Jewish community after Jewish community, and most of them they wiped out. And the reason, and they were in a religious frenzy. They were going to do anything it takes to win these Jews over to their side, and the Jews responded with their own religious frenzy, which is characterized by suicide and by killing of their own children. And that's described over here, as we're going to be reading through it. And they'll say, you know, parents will say a bracha as they shech the child. And this happens. And Bachurim, Basulas, and once again, great people, famous tzaddikim, and these are written, of course, by survivors. And so these 4 read differently than the other kinos. And the reason they read differently is simply because the poets who write the other kinos never saw the Beis Hamikdash. They read about it. They never saw the destruction of Beitar and all this. They read about it in the Gemaras and the Midrashim. This is not something you read about. And that's why it has a certain freshness in a horrifying way that you don't see anywhere else. And all through here, you see the idea, which is, where's God? Why don't you do anything about this? Halela Tisabak, are you just standing there doing nothing? And even the very first one we see starts by saying, Hachrishim Yimene V'Adabra V'Yavar Lamai. The other people, he guys screaming and cursing and complaining, and the others are saying, shh, take it easy. And he's saying, Hachrishim Yimene V'Adabra, just shut up and get me out of the way. I want to say what I want to say, V'Yavar Lamai, I don't care what happens to me. I gotta get it off my chest. Because what I saw, unbelievable. And how could this happen? And don't tell me that people were bad, because it describes that he's a Chomas Esak V'Shod L'Chol Shem Shemaim. I screamed against you, God in heaven. Chomas Esak V'Shod, I tied against the violence, L'Chol Shem Shemaim. To you, the God in heaven. Because he said like this, everybody was from there, Tzaddikim, the women was unbelievable. You know, what's going on over here? Hetzikasni Ruchi, my spirit is surging within me, V'lo Uchal Adom, and I can't shut up. So I don't want to hear somebody tell me this is politically correct or not politically correct. But yeah, I don't care what happens to me. You understand? Kayoleda F Eshamon. I'm like a woman giving birth. You can't tell a woman in the birth bag, don't scream. Right? It hurts. You see? Mishped Mar Esev Akonim Mehima. I'm going to make a bitter hesped, bitter, and I'm going to scream. Divri Shagosai Yitchu Piyamo. And I don't care if my screams are loud as the sea. Sifti ala dosei Hashem l'shama, because you have to make a hesped for my whole Edo that was given l'shama, right? And he goes on and he says, "You want me to be quiet? Are you crazy? Eich shavas mesos v'arva simcha. How can you tell me that all joy is gone? You can't tell somebody like that go back to being normal. Every face is destroyed." And Besulosai, Bachurei Nosaf, when the Sicha, look, Barosh Kalchusim, this is written right after a massacre. He says, look out in the street. The place is full of dead bodies. naked bodies all over the place, as we saw. The Jews either killed themselves or were killed by the Crusaders, and then the bodies were stripped and thrown out into the streets to be eaten by dogs. That's what they did, right? My children, my own children, he says, and the children of the community are like sheep for the slaughter. You better scream over this. And you better be full of tears. I don't hear, like he says over here, don't tell me anything what it is. And not only that, but he said, like I said, you find with these things the taina in heaven. And one of the halacha is that you are permitted to learn certain things on Tisha B'Av, right? One, it has to do with the Eicha and the Gemaras that deal with the Churban Beis Hamikdash. That's one. And what's the other thing you're permitted to read on courage, I should say, to read on Tisha B'Av? Does anybody know what I'm talking about? The book of Job, Eov. And what is Eov all about? It's about this. What happened? What yeah? Eov is not just a story in the Weltrein. He suffers all his misfortunes and he didn't do anything wrong. At least that's what he says. And by the way, God does not say to him ever, you did something wrong. So he is righteous. You know what I'm saying? Hashem does not say, oh, you're forgetting this affair and that affair. That's not the point. And so he's asking over here, he's saying, what's going on? Aram, I want the angels to cry. Right? How come you didn't intervene? Get together in crying sessions. I want to hear you cry like a woman giving birth. Right? Why not? And then, of course, he goes on to say, and is this not worthy of your concern? Was this not worthy of divine intervention, which didn't happen? I mean, wasn't this a group that they all committed suicide for Yiddishkeit? Isn't this a group that gathered together in absence of purity for Kiddush Hashem? Isn't it true that each one encouraged the other one to kill themselves? Didn't they all encourage themselves to cling b'yira tahora, believe without bending to avodah zarah? Isn't this a group in which no one had any pity on the gever or the gvira, abundance for estifara? You know, when men, women, children, avol ozra gvura yisera, didn't it take a great deal of gevura, lahalom kos, for liquid shedra, to smash the head and sever the spine? Didn't it take a lot to do that? And didn't they say to themselves as they committed suicide, Lo zachinu l'gadlam b'torah? Didn't they say to their own children, when they killed their own children? It's a sad story, but we talk about this. Didn't they say to their own children, Lo zachinu l'gadelchem b'torah? We weren't zeicher to raise you in Yiddishkeit. Nakrivim kol l'torah. We're going to offer you like a carbanola. V'nizki machem l'orah. And we'll all see you in heaven in a minute. We'll all be zeicher to see the light. Hatzfunim ein kol v'aluma, which is hidden away. No, it's the Gan Eden. Let's put it this way: these people were fool enough to put this does not deserve a hesped. This does not deserve that the angels should cry. This does not deserve, and you tell me I should shut up? I shouldn't say anything about it? And they all gathered together and they agreed as a community to accept this. It was the Canaan, the Shem Rananim, it was the elders that went first. That they not only went first, they chose to go first. And the enemy, the Crusaders, went after them, and they were all killed. And you saw the blood and the fats all over the place. In other words, when the enemy comes in or they kill, you stab people in the bellies, junk all over the place. Like in the temple when they had the korbanos, the fats of the animals. So, and how do you explain how you're supposed to react to the fact that fathers who a minute ago were rachmanim, a parent, nobody cares about a child. They'll go crazy if they get scraps of knee. Now they became cruel like animals. By fisal of us, and they actually had to draw lots. This is sad. A whole group gets together, and this happened repeatedly. They all commit suicide. How do you do that? And the short answer is like this: you can't do it. Most people don't have what it takes to stick it into themselves, and that's understandable. So somebody's got to do it. What I mean to say is there's a mechanics. It's very sad. Listen, there's a mechanics to this business. So how do you do it? And they draw lots. The one who draws the lot, he gets shechted with the knives. Bachurim alei tola amunim, and then you see a site which Bachurim alei tola amunim from the richest families. That's from the book of Eicha. It's Hamunim alei sola, the ones who were raised with red scarlet, like you would say today in America, born with a silver spoon in the mouth. Okay, the Hamunim alei tola. But of course, the scarlet now is different. It's the blood, isn't it? He says, "Amunim alei tola heim lochachu afer kataninim." You see them, licking the dust like the serpent's nose is shechted, and and the body goes out. So he's saying over there, and nothing. And you want me to be quiet about this? V'akalos levush shanim, and the girls, those young girls, the teenage girls, the levush shanim wearing fancy clothes, mulafis b'zros chasidim, they faint in the arms of their chasanim, and this is probably exactly what happened. I mean, the horrifying thing is so bad. I'm sure people just passed out from the horror, and of course, and then they were killed. You understand? When they see people chopped up with swords and spears, you better remember this. Don't tell me to be quiet. Don't tell me not talk about it. Now, by the way, you see that there are some Jews out there who are saying don't talk about it, because he's responding to that. And what gets up in the kinos is this, right? And there are people who say even today, don't talk about the Holocaust. No, it's uncomfortable. Why bring all that stuff up? And he said, you better know this. You don't be silent and fail to offer kinim. When you have these stories, they deserve a hesped. That's why he's nafshi. That's why I'm depressed. Because if I didn't have nafshi aguma, if I wasn't depressed, I would not be normal. Okay? And how come the Torah isn't crying over this? Right? First of all, I didn't hear nothing from the angels. Second of all, look at the Torah itself. He sees Torahs in the street, ripped and torn. And first of all, you're ripped and torn. Second of all, why didn't you do something about the people who learned you and are now killed? Because after all, the Sefer doesn't mean a thing if there's nobody left to do it. Right? Evel Yachid Asilach, why don't you make a powerful Evel, Avelus, who misber Taruma, and make a terrible hesped, because you've lost everybody that made you relevant. Your sailors, notice the Talmid Chacham who learned you and were able to see what they call the Yam HaTalmud that steer you through the waters. All those know the histories of it. Who's going to learn you now? Who's going to give the kashas and the teretz? Who's going to learn all the halacha parts over there? Don't you think you should be crying over this? You're an orphan too, because there's no point in having, as they say, a Torah. It's like they have now. You have a Torah in the museum. You ever see it from the Holocaust on it? Big deal. I mean, it's okay, but you know what I'm saying? Big deal. The Torah doesn't belong in a museum. What's the point? Right? Claim you lost your weapons over here. And he goes on and on about this. And the rest of us are in terror. Where the rest of us are asking ourselves that life stinks so much that, like it says in the Tocha, in the morning you say, when is the day over? At nighttime you say, when is the nighttime over? Life stinks, right? You see death and swords all over the place. How come the Torah doesn't do anything over here? And all he can do at the end, this is very human, is appeal to God to take vengeance. What else can you do? You can't take vengeance. Right? You can only take God to. I'll give you an example. After the Holocaust, when all said and done, to be perfectly honest, what happened to Germany? Nothing. If you want to be honest about it. What happened? They're actually bailing everybody else out now, right? They're a very powerful country. Nothing really happened to them. A few people got hanged. Nothing happened. And he says, and he ends, Hal Ela Tisabak, Adon Kotzim, I appeal to the angels. I appeal to the Torah. What about you, God? Are you going to sit back and do nothing? You were the master of all creatures. Are you going to sit there and do nothing? Don't you? I think you should take vengeance for all this blood that was shed. You say in the Torah that God, Ata'aku, Mishod Aniyim Ata'aku, that it says in the Navi, when God hears the cries and the violence given to the poor and the dispossessed, this arouses him to anger. So, no. Okay? Am Shavi Pesha Lunim Richamo. Show a little bit of mercy to the Am Shavi Pesha, those who were repentant, or the Umim, and the Rumim, who have drunk the poison, we drunk the gall and the wormwood. Osam Bal Tachrimam. Don't make a chorban of us, Karbam Hagbi Varima, but rather raise them up to something greater. And the other three are along the same lines. I'm not going to take the time to read all of them, but just to point out one. We're going to read all four together in a time. But you see the same thing again a few pages later. Me'ikin Roshi Mayan, Vinam Karnozlai. Here you find, as I said before, a more stylized and less direct kind of kino, in which he says, I wish I had a whole ocean of tears, that whole business. And the reason is because here he's like a historian. He wants to tell you what happened. Of the Gzeir Shum, Shvir Ramaiza and Magensa that we spoke about before, where he says, Evka Yumosai, look at the second paragraph on the page. The Moatit Nainvix the Bochim, I'm going to cry for those Besifrim, the Chorchim Tevluchim, who are wrapped in safers and shafted that way, like the Germans did. Some of the people, they literally wrapped in Torah scrolls and then cut their throat. They thought that's going to be fun. And he gives you the details over here when he says, Pamayim Kiddush Hashem Amiyucha B'Morah, at the top of page 280. There was 2 times that they underwent a Kiddush Hashem. They were attacked twice. Besim Shloshim Chodesh Yotaro on the 23rd of Iyar, and the next month, and the 3rd of Sivan, while they were in Shul reciting Hallel in song. The Chodesh B'Kriyas Hallel L'Shoro, if you recall, inspires the Crusaders were coming, and the Jews thought that, listen to this, they said it's dangerous to leave the house, which of course it was, and the enemy was planning to attack and kill the Jews when they're in Shul. So instead of saying, we're not going to go to Shul, they said like this, it was Yom Tov, it was Shavuos. Instead of davening at 9, let's daven at 5 or 5:30, like that. And that way we'll be out by 7:30, and by the time they show up, they won't be there. And that's talking what happened. But 11 people were caught at the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe they came late or something. And if we're in the middle of Hollow, at the time, meaning it's the day of Shavuos, it's the day when none of this should be happening, and in spite of all the rest of it, it wasn't a Hollow. And then in the next chapter, Adir Megensen, and they moved to Mainz, and there they have the mass killings, and then Mechodesh Shlishi, he goes on and on about this, and I'm not going to go through all of it, because as I say, we're going to be reading it now all together, and you have the English, you don't need to do so. The others, again, are more stylized. If you look once again on page 298 in Amarti She'umi Meni, that's right, it's the same word, here again is the bitter one. She'umi Meni means, I said like this, leave me alone, I want to complain. Once again, people in the community are telling them, don't talk about it, don't curse God, don't say anything. And Amarti She'umi Meni B'chiyamar, get away from me, I want to let it out. Mar Nafshi B'Rosh right? I got to get the bitterness of the soul out. You, who weren't there, you can't tell me to be quiet about it. Just like nobody today could tell somebody who went through Auschwitz and said, don't talk about it, or something like that, or how can you say that? And here he gives, once again, on the second page, very graphic scenes of the parents killing the children. Right? He says, Kavash Av Racham on page 300. Kavash Av Racham Lezevach, the father suppresses his own compassion to shech the children. And the children are saying, why are you killing us? Because when you're a 3, 4, 5-year-old kid, they don't understand what's going on. And they're telling the mothers, well, you're shechting us. What's going on over there? And they're dragging them out. Because we had this picture, if anybody was here a couple weeks ago, we talked about in Mainz, where, it's very sad. The children are hiding under the furniture. They don't want to be killed. It's easy for adults to talk about Kiddush and all the rest of it. The kid's a kid. And the mothers drag them out and shech them. Who can hear this and not cry? Of course, Ishma. And again, this we saw happened, I think, in Cologne, where they're coming, and the father says like it's, I'm going to shech you, I'm going to make the bracha, shek yishon b'mitzvos of Zivano al Kiddush Hashem, and then the son says Amen, and then the father shech the kid. This happened. He says, Haben nishchad, of course Shema, Rios Kol Nishma. and more, as you're going to be reading through over here, the father kills the children and kills himself. He falls on his own sword. All this is to say that we do not understand Tisha B'Av as only referring to the Churban Beis Hamikdash and the famous stories that are accepted there, but we understand the Churban Beis Hamikdash applying to Jewish tragedy in general, and that's why they're included. They decided the Ashkenaz, which we have here, that's the keynotes we have today. The Ashkenazi Jews decided to put the Crusades in there. Plus, you also have the factor that this was seen as very heroic, and the reason it's heroic is because they could have saved their lives. Nobody had to do any of this in the sense that anybody wanted to convert would save them and their children, and they were so certain that it's a big. What's the big deal? Are you killed now? And we'll all meet in 2 seconds in Omaha. What's the problem? Really? But to give in to the enemy, to the Kroa Berchaim, to give the men the Nita Borazor, that's unthinkable. And that gives us a special quality that deserves commemoration on Tisha B'Av, obviously. And what it means is that they see the destruction of communities as a kind of Churban Beis Hamikdash. Because at the end of the day, the Beis Hamikdash was a building. It was, like it says, the God destroyed a building. The people is not a building. When you had whole kehillas that set themselves on Kiddush Hashem, this is a Churban Beis Hamikdash. In the same way that we have Gedolim that were killed the way they do, like a Second World War, but this is a Churban Beis Hamikdash. And the Gemara even says, Shkol Mesa Tzadikim and Churban Beis Hamikdash. So the idea is the Kedusha that this personifies. Without taking any more time, now we'll read all 4 of these in a row. And as I say before, as we do, you can see the English translation. I know many people have seen this many times before. And here we go.
Which 4? They can just give me.
It's on the page here. Yeah. It's Achrishim Enemy Hiroshima. See it? In other words, I'm talking about 5, 6, 7, 8.
Oh, okay.
5, 6, 7, 8. They're all the same. A few hours. The people who wrote the Kinos, for the most part, never saw Israel, could only imagine it. And that made Israel a more magical quality, and perhaps even for you and I, who visit the physical Israel today, but as we know, you don't necessarily, unless you have a different vision, you don't see the Israel of tomorrow. You don't see the Israel, sometimes you do, but it's not easy to imagine the Israel that we all hope for. Okay? This is only, nobody says that the Midnat Yisrael is the end of everything. We say, hopefully it's a step on the way to the end. Okay? We hope. And the best example of this is, of course, from Yehuda Levi, who, as everybody knows, is a famous poet in Spain. And he wrote a lot of different poems, obviously. Love poems, this poem, that poem, religious poems. And he lived in Toledo, and he had a good practice. He was empty. He had a good practice. And he also was involved with contemplating the Jewish condition in Golos, and the Christian and the Muslim made so much fun of the Jews. He lived right in the middle of the Crusades and all that, so, all these passions are there, and the Jews are junk, as everybody says. And in order to reply to all this, he composes in his mind the Kuzari, as everyone knows, which is this long dialogue that he made up between the king of the Khazars on the one hand, and the rabbi on the other hand, trying to persuade him to become Jewish. The rabbi said, I'm not trying to persuade you to become Jewish. If you want to become, it's your business, and I'll answer your questions, but you have to decide on your own. And page after page, the king of the Khazars, he's asking questions. Why do you Jews do this? And why does the Bible say that? Why do Jews make a golden calf? 1,000 of different questions. And the rabbi, the chaver as he called him, is always giving him the answers over there. And what's really happening, of course, is that these are issues he's playing out in his own mind. And he's using the form of the dialogue to play devil's advocate, literally, and angel's advocate. As I'm sure it bothered him why the Jews made a golden calf, and then he gives you the reasons why he did it. And all through the book, every once in a while, you find that the king asks him a question, and it's a tough question. And the question's like this: so why do you live in Baltimore? Right? Because one of the things about the Kuzari is that Jews are a master race, a superior people. Really? How's that work? He said, if you go back to Adam Rishon was the best, and Cain and Hevel had issues, but then Chase was better than them. It's the genetics. It's the spiritual genetics. And Shem Cham V'Yaveh, Shem was the best of them, and Avram comes from the best of Shem, and Yaakov comes from the best of Avram. So we're the choice of the choices, and God cares about us more than anyone else. He always carries on about this at great length. The Kuzari is a masterwork of Jewish religious racism. You understand? That we're spiritually genetically superior to the others, and the chosen people, and everything about us is special. And that being the case, Eretz Yisrael is not just another country. Do you think it's for the heck of it that God says, Lech l'chol aretz asher erecha, I'll pick a country to give to you, and God just says, let me pick some country in the Weltermine? Eretz Yisrael has magical, mystical qualities that are there from Sheshis Mei Abreshis. And that's why, only when the time was right did he tell Avram, after Avram recognized the one God, that come and I'll put you together. And the connection to the Jewish people with Eretz Yisrael is not just a country like the French with France or the Italians with Italy. It's something of a different quality. You follow? And the reason is because of the spiritual dimension, and that when the Jews are in Israel, it's not just a country living there, like a secular Zionist, not like a country living there to have your own country. That's good too. But it's much, much more than that, or it can be. And therefore, the Jew, if he can clear his antenna, if he can clear the arteries, they can feel the Kedusha. And you live differently, a qualitative different life. So that means that even though Israel, from a physical point of view, looks like any other country, obviously, but for those who have the right glasses, they can discern the Kedusha in it. And in that sense, if this is true, then the king keeps asking the rabbi every few pages, so how come all the Jews don't move to Israel? Right? It was so great. And what does the rabbi answer over there? I have no answer for you. He says, Nitzchuni. Every time he says that, he says, you got me on that one. To some degree, we're hypocrites, he says. This is what he says. And the king keeps poking him about it, till finally, as the book comes to the end, the rabbi says, I guess, listen, you're right. I got to make aliyah. That's what he says. From this conversation, I taught you, but you taught me too. And the truth of the matter is, to be perfectly honest, I should live in Israel. And so and as the book ends, the rabbi makes preparations. I think, if I remember, the king might help him or something. He makes preparations to make aliyah. And this, of course, was the debate, the tension going on in the minds of the poet, of the author. Should he stay in Spain? Should he make it in Israel? Should, back and forth. And as he works it out, he says, listen, at the end of the day, let's cut the bull. Should make aliyah. And now, what's so easy in those days, as you know? And he died on the way. Okay? Because, what health is like in the 1100s. And there's no amoxicillin, no penicillin. And so if you catch any stupid thing, it's very easy. And that's what happened to him. He sailed from Spain to Egypt, and the Egyptian community took him in, they gave him a party and all the rest of it. Stayed there for a short while. He's going to go from from Egypt to Israel, and he caught something and died from it. That's what happened. There's a legend that he went to Israel and all that, but this is not true. He died along the way. And so you might say he never got to see the Tzion literally of his dreams. But being the greatest poet, a poet is a person who can express things that you and I can only babble about. So he describes it. And we mentioned this on Tisha B'Av because here we're talking about Eretz Yisrael, and we mourn the fact that we lost Eretz Yisrael physically. There's no question about that. And we also, but the other Eretz Yisrael is even more important. And here we talk about Tzion Halos Shalosh Shlom Sirach, that there's a living Zion that wants to know where are my people, the Shlom Sirach, where the fate of your captives, And he talks about over here that Tzion, says shalom to everybody, and he says, I can't get you out of my mind, all the rest of it. And he says in many places that I can just smell the place is dripping with Ruach HaKodesh. It says it there. What's wrong? You can't see it? What's wrong with you? And it drives me crazy that the Goyim are now in charge of Eretz Yisrael. But how can it's such a violation of the way it should be? And he says, just to smell the air, right? Chayin neshamas avir artzech. Just to smell the air is chayin neshamas. The air in Israel is not anywhere else. More grav kasofrich. And to me, the dust on the ground is better than the spices. You get it? This is, in other words, I know one thing. If he would ever get to Israel, first thing he would kiss the ground. Like people do. There's to him every little piece of Eretz Yisrael. The air and the physical and the thing all around him is Kedusha. And it's because, did God pick it for nothing? So, I know externally it looks like another place, but if you're able to get past the externals you can see over there. And again, I know everybody can read the English, so we're going to do that right now. It's late, but we mention that always when Tisha B'Av because this is our final goal. As I say before, we're trying to hang on to Israel now. They should be able to survive all the constant attempts by everybody to harm it. But we want to move from that goal to the Zion of Yehuda Halevi. I'm going to have a copy of it, and it'll take too long to explicate. Rabbi Weissman, of course, who had the terrible pain of knowing that they could pay off the Germans, they could have saved another 1 million Jews. They couldn't save 6 million, but they could save 1 million.
Really, that many?
Yeah, something like that. And because he was in Slovakia, and they used to have, in 1942, let's say they had 60,000 Jews, something like that. They took trains and carried off 2/3. But then, when the third left, somebody got to the German guy and says, I'll pay you off to call the whole thing off. He says, no problem, give me 35 grand and it's a deal. That's all, 35 grand. And they gave it to him and he stopped all the trains. And he said something like, if you give me 135 or something like that, $150,000, not that much money. He said, I can call the whole thing off. I'm in charge of the trains, I'm Eichmann's number, the Wisslitzini. He was high in the hierarchy of the SS. He says, I can make the whole thing stop. Poland, well, it's too late for Poland, but France, Holland, Greece, all the places, we'll stop the whole thing. It's crazy. And the world Jews wouldn't give them the money. It didn't happen. And he said he couldn't get over it. When he said, what if? So this, his Kina has not become so well known. They're trying now. But the one we're going to do is the one that's more known for Rabbi Schwab, who, as we all know, was not in the Holocaust. But on the other hand, he was beaten up in Germany in the 30s. That's why he came to America. That's one of the reasons he came to America. They did beat him up. And, of course, he survived the war over here. But like everybody else, anybody who lived through the 40s, he knows exactly what's going on. And it bothered him that nobody has a Kina for the Shoah. You understand? Years ago, and I know, anyone who's old enough, years ago there was nothing. And I understand why there wasn't anything, but he felt that it deserves to be mentioned over there. And we need not say anything about the 6 million or so that got killed. He says it. He goes through all over here: the gas chambers, the turning the people to soap, the cattle cars, Dr. Mengele going you to the left and you to the right. It's all in here. And once again, as I say before, since everyone has the kinas, so we'll just in this show we definitely don't have to explain what this is. Shtufi Mabul Dom, Shemosr Nafsho Shom,